Okay, we'll get started. Well, welcome to the fourth and final installation of World Animal Protection and Zoocheck's Wild Among Us webinar series, addressing exotic animal issues pertaining to the trade, the regulation, seizure, and sheltering of exotic animals kept as pets, and the associated animal welfare, public health, and safety and environmental risks associated with that. My name is Cassandra Conan, and I'm the global head of the wildlife campaign for exotic pets here at World Animal Protection, and I'll be moderating today's sessions. Zoocheck and World Animal Protection are two organizations working on exotic pet issues here in Canada and around the world. World Animal Protection is a global charity whose mission is to move the world to protect animals. And using evidence-based research, we expose animal welfare issues and work collaboratively with a range of stakeholders to identify and deliver positive, sustainable change. And Zoocheck is another Canadian-based international wildlife protection charity established in 1984 to promote and protect the interest and well-being of wild animals free roaming in nature and held in captivity. Working with a broad range of collaborating partners here in Canada and around the world, Zoocheck endeavors to promote animal protection in specific situations and strives to bring about a new respect for all living things in the world in which we all live. So we have a really great lineup of speakers today. This is a great way to wind up our month-long series. And it will take place over the next few hours. You'll notice that along the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A. Please click there if you want to ask any questions of our speakers. After each speaker, we'll take questions for about 10 minutes before we move on to the next one. I also wanted to let you know that we're going to be taking a stretch break after the third session for about 10 minutes. So with no further ado, let's kick off the session. Our first speakers today are Dr. Sara Dubois and Meghann Cant. Dr. Dubois is the Chief Scientific Officer at the BC SPCA, and Sara directs province-wide welfare, science operations, programs, and advocacy projects for the BC SPCA. She leads 4 teams of staff experts in animal welfare and policy, companion, farm and wildlife welfare, animal kind accreditation. And she has a BSc in biology from UVic and obtained her MSc and PhD in animal science from UBC, Animal Welfare Program. Sara started working for the BC SPCA in 2001 as a contract movie monitor for animals in the entertainment and has served as manager of Wild Art and provincial manager of wildlife services. She's also a registered professional biologist and serves as adjunct professor in the UBC Applied Science Program. Meghann Cant is the manager of companion animal welfare science policy at the BC SPCA. Meghann has worked for the BC SPCA in the areas of animal welfare science, education, advocacy, and policy since 2009. She has a Bachelor of Science in agroecology and a Master's of Science in animal welfare, both from the University of British Columbia. And over the years, she's volunteered for animals in a variety of settings, from veterinary medicine to wildlife rehabilitation to senior animal rescue. And her keenest interests are the exotic animal behavior, health, and welfare, and small mammals in particular. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Meghann to get her started. So just give me a second here to hand over the controls. Meghann, you should have them now. Meghann, we can't hear you actually. I think you're still on, I don't know if you're on mute or we can't hear you.
Can you hear me, Cass?
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe unfortunately.
So Sarah, yeah, so she definitely has control. If she clicks her mouse, she should be able to forward them, but we can't hear her.
Okay, that's too bad. Sorry, Megan.
So are we going to take it back and give it to you, Sarah?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure. I'll try that. Megan put together the most beautiful slides for her section, and too bad, but I'll try to do my best to represent her information as well. So at the moment, I can't advance the slides. You can see and hear me, but I can't advance the slides. Oh, there we go, maybe. Okay, we all good at this point? Everyone can see the slides and hear me? Okay. Well, hopefully Megan can retry and join us and be here in just a moment. So thank you so much for joining us. We wanted to just go over the BC SPCA's role in exotic animals, as well as a specific case study that we had recently involving servals. So Megan, of course, is our companion animal welfare science and policy officer, and has really been involved with our shelters in their management of exotic animals at the branches. So just to give you a picture of what that looks like, the BC SPCA is an organization. We were founded in 1895, and of course, we are provincial in nature. We have over just over 600 staff and 5,500 volunteers. We care for about 40,000 animals a year and conduct just over 8,000 cruelty investigations. We have 44 different locations, and that includes animal shelters, 1 wildlife rehabilitation center, and a provincial hotline as well. We have a variety of different programs, including animal health, behavior, welfare science, cruelty investigations, our policy areas, and advocacy and humane education, of course. Megan is back, and let's try your mic, Megan.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry about that, everyone. I have no idea. It worked this morning, but technical issues. So should I take over?
Yeah, if you'd like to take over the slides, if Cassandra wants to switch it, we can try that again.
Has it been switched? Can you hear me still? Okay, I lost controls last time. Oh, there we go. There we go, perfect. All right, sorry about that, everyone. So if we head back to this slide. So basically, here's a snapshot of what is quote unquote kind of a normal year for us. So our intake last year was just over 20,000 animals. And you can see the breakdown there with cats being the most, followed by dogs, then small animals such as rabbits and rats, and then birds, then farm animals and horses, then reptiles and amphibians, followed by fish, then exotic mammals, and finally by invertebrates. And you'll see that the servals there are the exotic mammals that we got in last year. Then if we take a look specifically at exotics, so here I'm including the reptiles, the amphibians, the birds, the invertebrates, the fish, and the exotic mammals, just to look at those over the last 10 years or so. You can see that our intake fluctuates quite a bit. Then on the trend line there, you have the percentage of what exotics represent as a percent of our total intake. So you can see the variability as well. But overall, I would say that it seems to be trending upwards. Then if we take a look at the different sources of these animals, so how they're coming to us, the top, of course, are owner surrenders, which is pretty common, followed by strays, followed by either seized or surrendered to one of our cruelty officers. And then we also have some of our shelters actually still have animal control contracts, so we receive some exotic animals this way as well. Then if we specifically look at surrenders, it's not surprising that housing related issues are the #1. It's the same for dogs and cats. We find that people are unable to find pet friendly housing, so they surrender their animals to us because of that. Next is a life change. So if that's perhaps if someone has a new baby or they get divorced or injury or illness hits the household, they might surrender the animal to us for that reason, followed by no time, too many other animals, and lastly, abandoned. So when people move out and leave an animal behind and someone else surrenders that animal to us. And if we take a look at species, basically of the, let's say 200 to 300, maybe a little over, exotics that we get each year, it is mostly birds and reptiles. Of birds, budgies tend to be the most common. And then we see bearded dragons, ball pythons, and red-eared sliders still come to us pretty commonly. And I would say these aren't so surprising because that's also reflected as what are some of the most common animals in the pet trade right now. Then if we look at some cruelty stats for the last 5 years, you'll see that we do quite a few investigations that involve exotics each year, around 200 or so. And these investigations typically involve more than one animal. So you can see there that I have the average number of animals ranging from 6 all the way up to 12. Definitely, as you know, lots of times when people are especially keeping birds and reptiles, they're keeping multiples of these animals as well. In terms of calls that we get, we do have a provincial call center that receives cruelty calls from across the province. So we get most common calls about birds and reptiles, which again is reflected in our intake as well, mostly about parrots or snakes. And the most common complaints would involve their living conditions, whether or not they're being given any food or water, or it's inadequate or the wrong type of food or water, and also whether or not they're being given veterinary treatment is also a common complaint. So once these animals are in our care, we actually have an internal exotics policy that helps to guide our staff in making adoptability decisions. And this policy is based on the 5 freedoms, which you can see listed there as a reminder. The 5 freedoms are actually built into our vision as well as our charter. So they're reflected in a lot of our position statements and policies too. And for ease of use for our staff, we've actually divided animals up into 4 different color categories you can see here, and I'll speak to those in a minute. And quickly, just before I go into those, I just wanted to point out that we, as an organization, have defined exotic animals and wild animals. We found this really helpful because I find that out in the public, people don't necessarily use the term exotic to refer to the same animals. I know that in veterinary medicine, for instance, exotic is just anything that isn't a dog or a cat. So what we decided to do was develop these definitions so that across the organization, there would be this common usage of the term as well as a common understanding of what we mean. So exotic animals are basically not domesticated, they're not indigenous, and they can be either captured from the wild or they can be bred in captivity. And for wild animals, so similarly, wild animals can be exotic or indigenous. They can also be born in the wild or born in captivity as well. So basically, we see exotic animals as a subset of wild animals. Now for our actual color categories. So in our green category, these are all domesticated animals. We consider them as an organization that they make suitable pets when a guardian can meet the 5 freedoms. And we adopt them out to people that are both new to the animal as well as have experience with the animal. Common examples, of course, that are commonly kept as pets: dogs, cats, rabbits, etc. Then for the yellow category, these are either domesticated or exotic animals. These are still fairly common as pets, but we consider them to have sort of an above average care commitment. So when we go to adopt these animals out, we're looking for guardians who have experience with them. We might also be looking at rescue groups or sanctuaries that are specialized, that also have experience with these animals. And above all, we want these animals to have their 5 freedoms provided. Examples of these would be chinchillas, hedgehogs, as well as some of your smaller birds like your canaries, your finches, your cockatiels, and your budgies, as well as farm animals like chickens and pigs. And one step up from there, we have our orange level of animals. So these are all exotic animals. They're sometimes kept as pets, but we consider that above the green and yellow categories, these require a significant level of resources and experience. There's an investment of resources. And so we're looking for very specialized guardians, rescue groups, or sanctuaries. Again, we want them to be able to provide the 5 freedoms. So these are animals such as sugar gliders, the turtles and tortoises, your medium and larger birds, such as your cockatoos, your Amazons, your African greys, as well as your non-venomous reptiles, and as well as amphibians. So bearded dragons and frogs would be included in this as well. And finally, we have our red category. So basically in this category are exotic animals who the BC SPCA does not consider to be suitable as pets. And in some cases, they are also illegal to be kept as pets. And I'll speak to that legislative piece in just a minute. And basically for these animals, we feel that is really not possible for the average guardian to meet the 5 freedoms. So we are not adopting them out to the public under any circumstances. So with these animals, we are looking for that sanctuary that can provide a very high standard of care. So examples of these would be servals, would be tigers, kangaroos. You're looking at your large constrictors as well as your large venomous snakes as well. And these are animals that we actually have seen over the years, perhaps in cruelty cases. So we definitely know that people have had these animals. And so that's why we've placed them in this category, just because we don't want the public to be owning these animals. So as I mentioned, I'll be speaking a bit to the legislation here in BC. So we have a controlled alien species regulation, which comes under our Provincial Wildlife Act. It was enacted in 2009. Right now, there are more than 1,000 animals that are listed, that are designated as these controlled alien species. And the animals that are on this list are basically animals that pose a potential threat to people, to property, and to other animals. And if they were to be released, they would pose a threat to wildlife and wildlife habitat potentially. And under this regulation, the government is able to control the keeping of these animals, the breeding, the selling, the shipping, and releasing of them. And examples, definitely it's a long list, so I've only provided a few here. But for birds, the only birds that are listed are cassowaries. The only frogs that I believe are listed are the poison dart frogs. And then there are definitely, that runs the gamut of animals. So I have a few examples there. You can see that we've got some large constrictors, some primates, some cats, dingoes, jackals as well. And so when we have this legislation at the provincial level, there's also the possibility for, of course, for cities to enact their own bylaws. And so municipalities above and beyond what's on the controlled alien species list, they could enact further restrictions. And so when municipalities come to us and they're looking maybe for some advice or some information for their own animal control bylaws, we're actually encouraging them to adopt a positive list. And I know this has been spoken about at previous sessions for this series of webinars. Basically, the main benefit to a positive list is that it doesn't need to be amended as often as a negative list. So a negative list, every time a new type of pet enters the pet trade, you might have to, amend a negative list, whereas a positive list is a shorter list and easier to maintain. So in our model animal bylaws that we provide, we basically have divided animals up into allowable animals and limited animals. So allowable animals are listed there. So again, these are similar to what we have on our green list on our own internal policy. So basically there aren't any restrictions on what can be done with these animals. Whereas with limited animals, these are more restricted, so you can own, rehome, or adopt, but you're not selling or breeding them. And here are some examples here. So these are similar to our yellow and orange on our internal policy as well. So basically under our model animal bylaws, people can only possess allowable animals. If they have limited animals, they are grandfathered in. And then again, as I said before, that the activities that are restricted is basically you can't sell, breed, import, or display limited animals. So that is basically reflects a positive list. Now I'll pass it over to Sarah.
Thank you, Megan. I'll just enable the slides here. Not quite yet. Okay, so as Megan said, the positive list approach was a great advocacy tool that we developed through our model animal bylaws that we can use for municipalities. And we've been using it for some time and it's been quite effective in communicating those issues at a local level. But provincially, of course, we have to take a different strategy because we have existing legislation and regulations. And it was a really good start. Led the nation when it was introduced. Controlled alien species in 2008 was the actual legislation. The regulations came in 2009, and then it took another year or two to actually work out a permitting process. And that was a pretty bold move at the government at the time. And unfortunately, it came out of tragedy. If you're familiar with the case, these are tigers in 100 Mile House. And unfortunately, there was a fatality on the property that really sparked the initiative for controlling alien species. And I was very fortunate to be a part of that process in developing the regulations and legislation. And I still sit on the committee that allocates permits for individuals who either got grandfathered in or who may be applying for a new animal. So the benefit of CAS is that it did identify which dangerous animals can no longer be kept. But the caveat here we're going to be identifying some gaps in this now that we can look back over the last 12 years of using this regulation, is that there's potential for tigers to still come into British Columbia with a permit. So the contingency was that a permit needed to be allocated. So at the time, the animals that were in British Columbia could potentially be grandfathered in if they met certain criteria within the permit process. Unfortunately, that permit process was really focused on public safety, whether the animals could get out of the enclosure and whether there was any potential risk to owners, not really focused on the animals' lives themselves. So there was questions about the cage size, what food and what veterinarian care you have for your animals, and to allow it to live out the rest of its life. But we know that doesn't necessarily provide a life worth living by just keeping animals in a cage like this. So thankfully, many of the animals were actually sent to sanctuaries, and about 100 permits were given out at the time to grandfather some of the less dangerous animals in British Columbia. One of the challenges and gaps we still have, of course, though, is there's not regular inspections of existing permits. So it is a complaint-based system. And of course, people still enter British Columbia, perhaps without knowledge of this legislation from another province where they were allowed to have these animals. And that can be a challenge too. The permit process review, so someone can submit a permit request if they're trying to move into British Columbia, or if you are a zoo, an aquarium, perhaps an education facility like a university, you can apply for bringing in an animal or breeding an animal that you already have. And this has left some gaps. And we've seen, actually, we thought all the tigers would be gone after this legislation, but just recently we're aware that tigers were brought into British Columbia for filming purposes for television and the movies. So we do have a large film industry here in BC, and it's possible that animals could come from California, or in this case, animals came from Ontario and were brought in on transitory permits. So they did leave after the filming purpose, but it was still a great risk, and we opposed that process. But unfortunately, permits are not decided by consensus, and it is just overall a government decision at the end of the day. If a permit was not approved, or if an animal was brought in illegally, the animal could be seized by the provincial government and sent to a rescue or a research facility, again, like an institution in the university. It could be sent to someone who has a permit, like a bug zoo or something like that, if the animal was listed. And there are some zoo options in British Columbia potentially as well for housing these animals that were brought in and are no longer allowed to be there under a permit. We also have been using, of course, out-of-province sanctuaries have been a role for placing animals, and that's been quite important. But what do you do about an escaped cheetah? So this was a cheetah photographed on the roadside of interior of British Columbia in December 2015, long after legislation and regulations had changed, and no one had a permit for a cheetah except one zoo in British Columbia. And so it was quite well known, though, that an individual had tried to bring a cheetah in and was denied through multiple different permit requests between 2014 and 2016, and conveniently lived in the very neighborhood that this cheetah was spotted. So they had purchased 2 baby cheetahs in 2013 from South Africa, brought them into Canada, and were trying to bring them into British Columbia to have them on display. They'd been denied all of their permits, but they did appeal one of their permit decisions. And a gap again in this legislation is that you can apply from multiple different addresses in different towns for different purposes. So you could live in one town, apply for an education or a rescue permit, and if you get denied, you can just move on over to another town and apply for a different type of permit. And this really drains resources for the permit adjudication process. If you're interested in this particular case, you can read about how the trial went and the appeal board decision. It was number 17 in year 2017. So if an animal is not on the controlled alien species list, there are, of course, still significant animal welfare concerns for exotic animals. We know everything from the animals we're seeing in shelters to ones we're seeing in cruelty investigations, that they, just because they're not on the list doesn't mean that there aren't concerns. And what's really challenging for an animal welfare organization is what options do we have to place these animals if they come to our care. So servals in particular Just to review who they are native to Africa, and they roam savannas and the wetlands hunting for prey. They're about the size of a medium-sized dog, and they do really retain their wild instincts, and we've unfortunately seen a number of them escape. They've been hit by cars, and they've starved, of course, out in the wild because they haven't had claws to actually kill anything or been shown how to predate on anything. And these animals are just extremely active. They jump, they play, they need very rich lives, and are not appropriate, of course, as pets. They're really difficult to house, and they mark their territory, so that often becomes an issue for owners. They require very specialized nutrition, and veterinarians, of course, don't have a lot of experience here, and they do require regular medical care. In British Columbia, thankfully, of course, and some other provinces across Canada, decline has been banned, but we know that many of these animals, of course, previously used to be declawed, and that's how they were kept by owners. And nowadays, we're getting complaints from veterinarians who actually are seeing kittens come in that are, of course, not declawed, and they're very concerned about their future in that home because these animals are already ripping up their owners' arms and legs and play mode, of course. So an animal could be declawed in another province and still brought into British Columbia. Of course, that's concerning. So overall, these animals were not designated, though, as being able to kill a person, but they still are a serious risk to people, children, and pets. And so it's unfortunate because their welfare and safety are very much compromised in captivity. The government, though, when they did create the list, and we had recommended many more animals to be included on the CAS list, they really cut it off at almost like a lynx-size animal. What could kill a person? What could really harm a person? And so the animals that are not CAS can still be bred, imported. They can be sold and kept privately, and their display is still quite. They're all unregulated, these areas. It means that these animals are in homes, and the expertise that vets have locally are very limited to care for these animals. And of course, resources that the owners have are limited because there's just not much you can do to provide sort of proper life for these animals in these captive situations. The challenge we have as an animal welfare organization when we try to investigate these cases is that there are no accredited sanctuaries for servals in Canada, and there are a few accredited sanctuaries overall in our country. So that is quite challenging for us to place larger exotic animals. We can't ourselves even house them temporarily very well, and providing care for them, again, is really outside the scope of most animal welfare organizations. Servals in particular have a following. Unfortunately, Instagram has made them very popular. Celebrities have made them very popular, and they sell for about $10,000 each. So if they're not regulated and you are a breeder of cats, you know, this is quite a lucrative opportunity. So the particular case from last year was some alerted to us. It was individuals who had actually bought the kittens, and they told us that they were finding that the kittens they had purchased were sick and injured, and we were getting these complaints across Canada and the US that there was a breeder in British Columbia we needed to look into. And so in June 2019, we seized 10 adult serval cats and 3 serval kittens in distress from a breeder in Little Fort, and this is just outside of Kamloops in the interior of British Columbia. The servals were found living in really horrific conditions. They were kept in RV trailers on the property. They were exposed to high levels of ammonia. Their litter boxes were overflowing, and there was no proper ventilation or access to water. The temperatures were extreme, of course, and the windows were covered. There was no natural light or access to the outdoors or potential to exercise. The food was insufficient to meet their needs. So you'll see how this comes out medically in just a moment. So the seizure was a challenge because, of course, these animals are very difficult to handle and contain. for our staff when we're on site, and then how do we transport them safely as well. So this is what you really have to think of when you're going into a large seizure like this, that this is not your average cat seizure. These animals had to be housed, and preparations had to be made well in advance at an undisclosed location because they couldn't be brought into our shelters. We really needed someone with wildcat experience, because we were going to have to hold these animals for potentially months, because the owner was going to appeal the decision that we made to go and seize these animals. So they have that right to do that. They can appeal it, and then we don't own the animals until that decision is made. Thankfully, the board did award us custody in September of all 13 animals, and they did not have to be returned to the owner. So it was only at that point that we could really make decisions about their futures. But of course, this required months of temporary specialized care, and now we could actually plan to send them to a permanent sanctuary. Sadly, of course, we're still in a place where we are preparing charges, but at this time, this decision by the review board doesn't stop these breeders from doing it again. So that's something that, of course, would happen if charges were approved and they were found guilty. So what do we do as an animal welfare organization now that we have ownership of these servals? We're not going to adopt them out. They're on our red list. Where do they go? And of course, we look towards the Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries as to potential options for these animals. So securing the placement is one of the first steps. And 13 serval cats are not going to be sent to one location. So we did have to really decide how they were going to be grouped. What could the receiving sanctuaries actually accommodate? Because that was a big ask for us to send all of these animals. We really needed experienced care providers and transport arrangements because, again, this is going to take quite a while to get them to their ultimate destinations. There's a tremendous amount of preparation that needs to go into actually just making decisions whether to drive or fly them. Weather conditions are a huge factor. You know, we had possession of these animals in mid-September, but we knew, but there are conditions for flying animals that they're at a certain temperature, you can no longer fly live animals in the US. And so that was going to be a barrier for getting them out before winter, basically. With servals, they're CITES 2, and so you have to ensure that there's an export permit held by the sanctuary, or held by us, and an import permit held by the sanctuary that they're going to, and so that can take some time to apply for. And then there's inspection processes at the border and other permits that the receiving facility needs to have. Health certificates from veterinarians need to prepare the week of, and the transport containers, every single last fixture on the container needs to be secured and really considered before sending them off in a flight, for example. We had to make very specific border appointments, cargo check-in times 3 hours ahead, pickup windows at the other location because you can only receive the animals until a certain hour at the location. So just a lot of coordination and logistics that need to go into this if you're planning this. To date, you know, we still have a ways to go, but there's over $40,000 that has been spent just in caring for the animals temporarily, plus all of the permits and transport arrangements. And we still have lots of staff time to go in this, the case that is to be submitted. We cannot say enough about the amazing sanctuaries where these animals have gone. So thankfully, the Wildcat Sanctuary took in 4 animals, Mama Ava and her 3 kittens, Belle, Chili, and Hal. They were driven down to Seattle from Kamloops and then flown directly to St. Paul, where they were picked up and landed in Sandstone. The Wildcat Ridge Sanctuary in Oregon took 2 animals, Cricket and Cane, and they were delivered by vehicle after our Seattle drop-off, so that was made on the same trip. And then about 2 weeks later, Carolyn Tiger Rescue was incredible, and they agreed to take 7 animals. They named them after popular artists, music artists, of course, which was quite sweet. And these animals had to be driven down to Portland because that was the only plane that could accommodate 7 animals at one time. So again, coordination is key here. And they were flown to Raleigh and then later picked up. These animals, though, of course, are now going to have lifelong health issues. And so that's the commitment the sanctuary is making. Ava was found to have an old leg fracture. It had already been repaired with plates and screws, but she has chronic metabolic bone disease. Belle had a very large hernia protruding in her abdominal area, and Chile had fractures in both left and right tibulas and fibulas. And these kittens were only 2 months old when they were seized. These things were already present, and so that's where the nutrition plays a big factor. Thankfully, Hal's healthy so far. At Wildcat Ridge Sanctuary in Oregon, Cricket unfortunately had a leg degloved and was missing a paw when he was seized, and he needed to have that limb amputated. He also had a right pelvis and femur damage. Kane had a broken sternum and that had healed in position. So these are pretty traumatic injuries for these young cats to have, and lifelong conditions. Carolina Tiger Rescue, the 7 servals that went there were all breeder animals. And so again, that's a major commitment to animals who have a history of metabolic bone disease. So how do we prevent this from happening again? Well, the breeding continues, unfortunately, in British Columbia and in Canada for servals. And the sanctuary capacity is very limited. And so we have to be very aware that these animals may not all have good outcomes. In BC, we felt that it was going to be really easy to just add servals to the controlled alien species list. We don't actually have to change the legislation. And we ran a campaign to the Director of Wildlife and Habitat that received over 8,000 signatures. Unfortunately, the government response is that they weren't open to adding. So this is the challenge with this type of list, of course. They were not going to add any new animals to the list until they wanted to do a comprehensive review. So we need to keep that provincial pressure up. And because these animals in particular are CITES listed, perhaps there's a federal initiative that can be taken as well. So our lessons that we've learned is that we did take a significant step forward in 2008 in BC, but these gaps are still there. Not only is the list too short for the species, the animal welfare protections that are for the animals on the list are limited, and there are loopholes to still get animals into BC. Exotic animals are still at risk. We're still seeing, of course, in the pet trade, breeding, sales, and possession issues. Our organizations are limited in resources to investigate and house these animals, and I'm sure all these organizations similarly across Canada have these challenges. As we've said, we endorse the positive list, but we need to really get more research on what's happening in Canada. Education, we found that it really resonates when you focus on disease risks. Unfortunately, some messaging around welfare doesn't always get through, but disease really pings people. And then, of course, in our pet store advocacy, we do need to also address the online sales and rehoming issues. And there are animals in homes. And as Megan said, we have to place animals. And so we need to ensure that husbandry resources are available for these animals. So thank you very much for your time. These are our email addresses if you'd like to reach out in the future.
Thank you very much, guys. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation and lots to kind of chew on there. We do have one question for you, so let me get right to it. Do veterinarians have a duty to report or log info into a database when they treat exotics? And if not, would that be something that's a helpful approach in managing and monitoring these animals? And do you think the veterinary community would be cooperative? That's a great question.
Great question. And I don't think there's a vet on the panel today, but in British Columbia, there's a duty to report animal cruelty, but there's not a duty to report any type of interaction with exotic animals. So if there was a controlled alien species, I would expect veterinarians to actually ask to ensure that that animal is legally being possessed. So veterinarians should be aware of the legislation, and if they do have clients with these animals, hopefully they are aware of their permit status, but they don't have to follow up in any way, to my knowledge, to check if that animal is appropriate or not.
Okay.
Megan?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of what would be really interesting is that there aren't a lot of exotics vets for sure. That's one of the limitations definitely is even with the animals, that we do adopt out on, the yellow and orange levels. Definitely it's important for people to find an exotics vet. And I think it would be really interesting to conduct research with these veterinarians to see what the most common concerns are. I know anecdotally, my own vet for my small animals, definitely husbandry is something that she talks with every client to make sure that, housing, nutrition, temperature, humidity, all of those things are so important. And it would be, great to conduct, I think, formal research on that, just so that we have a better understanding of the level of care that these animals are receiving.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Ryan Sparks. When large constrictors is mentioned under the Act, what is considered large? That's a great question. And are we talking about reticulated and Burmese pythons or something as small as boa constrictors?
So they have a length requirement under controlled alien species. So it is 3 meters. If it's larger than 3 meters, it is considered controlled alien species. And then they have a kind of restricted species zone as well, but most of the constrictors are on there, except the small ones. So rubber boas wouldn't be on there, for example, but the larger reticulated ones would be.
Great. And then it looks like a final question for you guys is, does the positive list take into consideration concern regarding invasive species?
The positive list that we have within the municipal bylaws?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Yeah.
Megan, would you like to answer?
Yeah, so definitely with a positive list, the list of animals that we consider allowable is very short, and those would be your domesticated animals like your dogs and your cats and your rabbits and stuff. So definitely the limited animals, and then if they're not mentioned as a limited or allowable animal, then they're not allowed at all. And so definitely that would consider the invasive species for sure. So the concerns over, releasing red-eared slider turtles and that sort of thing for sure.
Great. And I'm going to ask one final question. What do you think can be done to prevent these types of confiscations from happening?
We stop the breeding. We stop the source. That is, unfortunately, I think the general public thinks that if these animals are being sold, it's legal and it's all okay. Why would this be available online if it's not okay? And I see it on Instagram and people posting about it. So I think we really need to stop the source. Plus education. It's always a two-pronged strategy with policy and education.
Great.
Yeah, definitely, I would agree with the demand and the supply. Thinking about when Sarah mentioned about, so research has shown that if people are intent on getting these animals, talking about the animal welfare concerns isn't necessarily going to dissuade them. And so speaking more about the potential costs or the potential, safety risks that they may face by having these animals is often a way to sort of get them to think twice. So yeah, Sarah said definitely the two-prong to get at both supply and demand.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. We really appreciate it. And we're going to head on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Leland Gordon. Leland is the General Manager of Animal Services Agency for the City of Winnipeg. Leland has served as the Chief Operating Officer for the City of Winnipeg Animal Services Agency for 10 years. And his passion for animals started at a young age and remained important to him as he grew up. While attending business and flight school at the University of North Dakota, he volunteered at a local humane society as a dog walker, and he's recognized a need for programming that promoted adoptable pets. So he used his trusty dot matrix printer to create lists of adoptable animals and posted them in businesses throughout the community. Leland became an airline pilot with US Airways Express and worked his way up to captain. During his travels, he would visit local shelters and share his knowledge about promoting adoptable animals and inspired many shelters to utilize petfinder.com. Leland eventually shifted his career focus and became the executive director of 2 animal shelters in Ohio before his move to Winnipeg. Leland's other passions include sustainable living, the outdoors, and his family, which is great. So Leland, I'm just going to turn off my camera, mute myself, and then turn over the slides to you.
Hello. All right, can you hear me? Can you hear me? I don't know.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm just looking for the toggle switch here for the slide to go back and forth. It's usually on the bottom left. I don't see it right now.
You can try using your arrow keys.
Okay. Oh, that's working. All right, so I'll use the arrow keys here. So thanks everybody for listening in today. I want to put a good shout out to the team at World Animal Protection and Zoocheck for putting together this wonderful series. You know, exotic animals is something that in my past, I really never, it's not something I was overly interested or overly concerned about. You know, as I was growing up, as you mentioned earlier, you know, I ran animal shelters in the States. I volunteered for years at animal shelters. You know, traveling around when I was a pilot, you know, making contact with those shelters, I really didn't think much about those exotic animals. You know, once in a while I might see somebody, you know, at a festival or a fair walking around with around their neck, but most of my life has just been thinking about dogs and cats. And I think that's how most people are out there in the world, where they really don't overly think about the plight of exotic animals because it's not something they're very exposed to. And as we know, most people really just keep dogs and cats as pets. So that's a little bit about me from my past. About animal services, so we're the city of Winnipeg. We have a facility for stray dogs, but believe it or not, when I got here, I'm like, what do you mean you have a room for exotic animal control? I'm like, what is exotic animal control? So it's a picture I'll show you coming up. But what our team does here is we do animal control, bylaw enforcement, 24/7 emergency response to police and fire incidents involving animals. We have 3-on-1 support regarding lost animals. So all dogs and cats in Winnipeg are required to be licensed. So our 3-on-1 team reunites those pets. We do have an adoption program associated with our facility. Low-income spay and neuter. We don't have our own vet clinic here, but we have a contract with our friends at the Winnipeg Humane Society, where part of the funding from cat licensing, actually 40% of that funding goes and helps low-income residents in Winnipeg get their cats fixed. We also have a small northern outreach program where we're working with northern communities to take animals that are no longer wanted in those communities. So that's great for the community because it improves the health and wellness and safety of that community by removing unwanted dogs. But of course, it also gives a great start for a dog, giving that dog a second chance and a new start in Winnipeg. We have about 10,000 service requests. Most of those service requests come through our 3-on-1 service center. We take in about 1,000 dogs, and we're running about a 99% live release rate. So here's the room that I mentioned earlier. So when I got this job about 10 years ago, I'm like, what do you mean you do exotic animal control? And so this is our exotic animal room. The whole room can actually be superheated. It can be humidified. You know, we try and give exotics the best quality of life while they're with us here. But it's very rare also. In Winnipeg, like we've got lots of snow on the ground today. It's very rare that we actually see exotics. You know, they come from police incidents. You know, somebody's found one in an apartment building, but we probably only get about 5 or 10 exotics. I'm talking about snakes, lizards a year here. If they are legal, we will try and find a home for them. If they're illegal, we'll work to try and find a sanctuary or a zoo that can take them. You know, we've been changing our laws in Winnipeg over the years. In 2012, we implemented our new responsible pet ownership bylaw. And we're the second major city in Canada at that time to prohibit use of exotic animals in circuses. Our bylaw, the responsible pet ownership bylaw, does have an exotic animal piece in it. I would say that there's moderate restrictions regarding what exotic animals can be owned. At the time when we were making lots of changes in our bylaw back in 2012, 2011, you know, the exotic piece was not overly supported by the exotic animal groups in Winnipeg. What they wanted more was the PJAC rule, which essentially allowed for more exotics to be owned as pets, you know, larger animals with larger lengths. But ultimately, that portion of our bylaw was unanimously passed by council. And so now I'm moving more into my topic, how do we change minds on exotics? And this is actually a bearded dragon that was impounded here a while ago. I think that the number one thing when you're talking to, you know, residents in our communities that are not overly engaged in the exotic piece is really to be focusing on the quality of life aspect. In other words, when you look at this, you know, the quality of life of this bearded dragon is it'll probably live in a container like this for its entire life. And when I give tours of our facility here, and I start talking about that topic, people kind of go, oh wait, in the wild, something like this should really be, you know, hanging out in a forest or hanging down by the river. But instead, this animal will be able to go 1.5 feet each way for its entire life. The other topics, of course, are, you know, very, very, you know, thoughtful, like public safety. Obviously, there's public safety issues with more bigger exotics, venomous exotics. And then the final piece, of course, is the disease risk, where you can get certain diseases from handling these, especially with at educational/entertainment events. You know, again, with the quality of life piece, you know, we want the best quality of life for our dogs and cats. And we know that people, you know, really will go out there as far as making sure that their dogs and cats can have great amount of exercise, best quality foods. They're really given, you know, the best quality of life. But again, when we talk about our exotics, we don't really do that for the most part. And, you know, I'm not going to read this whole piece here, but you think about a ball python, where if it's purchased, say, at a pet store or a breeder, you know, they really get the basics, where you have the container, it just needs a heat rock, it might need a light. But, you know, when you think about how far a ball python can go in the wild and the different types of topography it is, you know, that's ultimately what we need to be gearing our communities for, is that the quality of life issue is so much more of a piece where we should want these animals living in the wild and not living in small containment systems in somebody's house. You know, in regard to, so we saw the previous slide where that's how ball pythons are supposed to live. And this is, you know, from a Kijiji ad a while ago. And it just, you know, when you read it, it's just very sad how you read it, where, you know, this animal is ready to go to be bred. It can just live in a Tupperware container and slide into your rack. And again, you know, it's not fair, because we know that these animals have that opportunity in the wild to have a better quality of life. So stuff like this should be unacceptable in our communities. And this was very recent this year. You know, this made national news in Winnipeg, where we had, you know, a ball python that was spotted near one of our universities here. And it would, you know, stuff like this becomes one of the top stories in the media. But usually when the media cover it, they don't really focus on the humane aspect. In other words, they focus on, oh my God, all these people could have been attacked and killed by a ball python, which we know won't happen. We don't focus on, you know, why is this snake out there? Where was it living? Why is it not in the wild where it's supposed to be? Why is it even in Canada? And, you know, when you talk about, you know, some people who sell these will say all the snake need, a ball python is a very easy animal. All it needs is an aquarium and a rock, because they don't really want to go anywhere. You know, sometimes I hear that, well, these snakes aren't very smart anyway. They just have an on-off switch, so they don't really need much to be happy in captivity. Well, with this snake, we spent about a week and a half looking for this snake. And not only did Animal Services, my team of officers, look for this snake, but we engaged the Winnipeg Police Service. They have a cadet group that went out and looked. We engaged provincial wildlife officers. We even engaged the exotic groups to go out and look. And we all went and looked. And we looked over acres and acres and acres for this snake, and we never found it. And it probably died a slow, awful death. But the problem is, if this snake was so happy in an aquarium, look on this adventure that this snake went. So these animals, in my opinion, do want to go out and explore, but they shouldn't be exploring in Winnipeg at a university campus. They should be exploring in the wild, where I feel they should be. These are some of the animals that we've seen here over the years. And this, you know, from our understanding, you know, at a provincial and federal level, this is legal to keep animals like this. In these different scenarios, it makes me feel very sad, you know, to see an animal being kept in a Rubbermaid container and to see that it has the basics, therefore it is okay. And the same thing with that bearded dragon, you know, where in this scenario, the bearded dragon can go a foot back and forth. So really the solution about this kind of stuff is really working with our communities to kind of explain that this is not okay. And you know, I have no doubt in my mind that owners of these exotics love these animals a lot, but I'm not sure that these animals love them in return, where, you know, I think these animals would rather be exploring and having that better quality of life in the areas that they're supposed to live. Same thing here, same type of topic, where, you know, what the children say, again, we need to educate children a lot, but we also need to focus on adults, because it is the adults who are buying the exotics. You know, the snake on the left's probably having a great quality of life, and the snakes on the right, you know, in these breeding systems, you know, it's not a great quality of life. There isn't enrichment. There isn't ability to exercise and go out and do things. Traveling shows. So as we know from the presentations I've listened to over this series, you know, there are lots of traveling shows out there. And as we all know, they focus on the guise of education, right? It's all spun as being educational. But in reality, we know this is a lot about entertainment, you know, where these exotics will go to birthday parties, corporate events, public events. There's all basic issues with traveling shows. You know, these animals that are used to living in humid climates are out and about. They're being exposed to the incorrect temperatures and humidities. They can get injured from being handled. We know they're under stress, you know, by taking them out of their regular enclosure where they're relaxed, and now they're being held by different people. There are those disease issues. And, you know, it's important that we also say that, you know, from these shows, especially there's some people that have the animals that are legal, but also they may have illegal because they have special permits or whatever. You know, some of those people who handle those legal and illegal animals will want to go and buy one. And so it's very interesting when you have somebody saying it's not okay for you to have one of these illegal, but it's okay for me. So ultimately, there's going to be a percentage of those people who go out as a result of being educated and purchase an exotic animal. And of course, they are revenue driven. You know, it's a revenue driver for whatever organization is partaking in those shows. And as we know, there's lots of ways that we can be educated without exploiting exotic animals. You know, I don't need to go check out a killer whale or a dolphin or you know, an octopus or a snake. I don't need to have that right in front of me. I don't need to snuggle it. I don't need to touch it and feel it to be able to be educated. There's lots of things that we can be educated about without having to personally hold that thing. And so in regard to the exotic piece, obviously you can learn a lot about exotics from the internet, from TV or libraries. You know, our children's lives will probably still be fine if they don't get to snuggle some large snake or a ball python or a bearded dragon. So it's important to understand that in regard to the education piece, you know, there are ways that we can do that without having to exploit those exotics. In Winnipeg here, we have something called Winnipeg Lost Dog Alert on Facebook, which is a great organization. And of course, it's Winnipeg Lost Dog Alert, which people post dogs they found or dogs they've lost, and residents work together to get animals back to them. Not only that, Animal Services, we post pictures of all the dogs we found and we put them on Winnipeg Lost Dog Alert. But as you can see from this slide, lots of people are also losing their exotics. And that's very sad because most of these exotics will end up dying. They can't survive in our climate. And, you know, in regard to birds want to fly. From my understanding, growing up, birds want to fly. They want to explore. So these birds go missing and then they end up dying. Same thing with lizards and snakes, right? So it just shows that there is suffering associated with this. And these animals want to do what they were designed to do. They want to have their natural behaviors. And those natural behaviors really can only truly be demonstrated when they're living in their natural habitats. Other things we're seeing, as we know, you know, in regard to venomous snakes, you know, in Winnipeg, our laws, venomous snakes are illegal, but outside of Winnipeg, in Manitoba, there really aren't those laws at the provincial level or the federal level. And it's very interesting where, you know, you can import venomous snakes that will kill people. It seems like there's more restrictions on you know, importing other things versus venomous snakes. So you can also breed them. You know, in parts of the country, including Manitoba, outside of Winnipeg, you can breed alligators as pets. You can breed venomous snakes. You can breed venomous snakes, as are shown in this ad here. And that's something where, you know, we need to be talking, you know, or stakeholders need to be engaging the governmental agencies at the provincial, federal levels. And really, I think a big part of it is I don't think our leaders at those levels of government are aware that these animals are legal and these animals can kill people. So that ability to sell and breed, especially dangerous animals, you know, we can talk about how the humane issues or the quality of life animals for exotics that aren't going to kill anybody, but the no-brainer one is really not allowing organizations and individuals to be breeding and owning these really dangerous venomous, and all the large snakes, of course, and alligators, crocodiles, those types of animals. This is a caiman. We actually seized this years and years ago. It was, you know, even though we have laws in Winnipeg that prohibit this stuff, believe it or not, some people still don't follow our laws. So this was found in the home in a major police incident. And we went ahead and, you know, took care of it. We worked with our partners in the community. And I believe this animal, you know, was saved and went on to live its life. But again, nobody needs an animal like this as a pet. And I think a lot of people, who are especially in the exotic world, remember this years ago. And this was a pivotal opportunity, and a very sad opportunity, of course, right? To really show how the gaps in the laws across the country allow people to keep large snakes as pets, or even venomous snakes. And I know that after this awful incident happened, lots of organizations and government organizations as well did reviews of their bylaws. And in our area, at the provincial level, there was a great review done, but unfortunately at the provincial level, there never was, laws were not changed. And essentially in Manitoba, it's left to the municipalities, but outside of Winnipeg, most municipalities do not have a lot of resources to be able to make their own laws governing exotic animals. So in reality, that governance, in my opinion, should be, you know, at a provincial and a federal level. So what are some things, you know, and I'm not seeing this whole slide here, but you know, this is my last slide. So what are things that nonprofit organizations especially, so if you're operating a nonprofit animal shelter at a municipal level or a provincial level, or you're a national or worldwide organization, you know, those are the groups that really, really, really can try and engage residents and also can engage governmental leaders. But the different things that you can do is, you know, scan major cities weekly for opportunities to say something about this piece, to engage those stakeholders. Look for, you know, you can have all the major newspapers and all the major media outlets across Canada and all the major cities. And when you see, oh, there's a snake running loose and the media is talking about it, that's the opportunity. You know, whether or not it's been in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg, Toronto, that's an opportunity to really engage the media outlets and engage the stakeholders and say, look at this and and we should not only be scared about this, because usually it's that they're so scary, but let's talk about the humane piece and let's talk about the ownership piece. So with those opportunities, have pre-made press releases ready to go. So the same moment that you learn about it, whether it comes from an animal shelter or whether it comes from just reading a media source, your press releases go out and they have both the safety aspect and they have the humane aspect in there, so that your information is also picked up with the media. Because if you wait a week after that, the stories already happened and they're probably not going to cover that kind of stuff again. But you want a relationship build with humane societies, SPCAs, you know, those groups can build policy statements and have those policy statements embedded in the press release. Of course, when you're giving tours of your facility, which is what I do here, you can always encourage the ownership of dogs and cats, and you can discourage exotics as pets. And then of course, engage event centers, children's museums, schools, anywhere that traveler shows may try to attend and exploit animals. That's an opportunity for you also to provide information and messaging to the leaders of those organizations in the form of either your press releases or your policy statements. In other words, get people to be more thinking about the quality of life issue and the humane issue. And of course, engage politicians, right? Where you want to engage politicians on the municipal, the provincial and the federal level to prevent a tragedy. In other words, as this exotic piece evolves and as more tragedies happen, but even before a tragedy happens, proactively reach out and explain to those politicians that these animals are allowed to be kept as pets in most places in Canada, and we're trying to prevent children from being killed, from a child going to a birthday party and going downstairs and getting attacked by an alligator. We need to understand that it's a very rare thing that happens in Canada, but that's not to say it can't happen in the future. So there are opportunities, daily opportunities to reach out, whether it be when you see something in the media where there's a snake loose, or whether if something tragic happened where a child's been attacked by an exotic animal. Those are the pivotal opportunities where your teams of communication people can really speak out and try and implement change and recommend change in our country. And that's all I have.
Thank you so much, Leland. That was a great presentation. Let me just look at some questions that we have here. Do you think the SPCAs and Humane Society should be more vocal on the exotic pet issues? Do you think that's something they should take on?
You know, I think it's easier for those types of organizations to be more vocal versus a governmental leader like myself. In other words, the government represents the community. The government, you know, we look for best practices from the community. So that's when we develop our bylaws here. We look for best practices. So in some jurisdictions, if you don't have somebody or a team that's actively looking for those best practices, that's where those SPCAs and their supporters and the humane societies, it's a lot easier for those groups to engage leaders at the municipal level and the provincial level and the federal level. And you know, my whole thing is like when I see these exotics here, and I feel very sorry for them, their quality of life, but I also know that in regard, there's a lot of exotics that are dangerous, and why would we allow, you know, people to have these types of animals? Like that's the easy thing. So the easiest thing I think with government is when you look at our bylaws, most of our exotic bylaws that are across Canada really focus on safety, protecting the public, where those bylaws exist. But I think as, you know, society evolves and we innovate, not only the next generation, the next versions of our upcoming bylaws, I'd like to see all those bylaws to not only focus on the safety piece, but also focus on the humane piece and the quality of life piece. But those bylaws will only get changed in those municipal, the provincial and the federal with significant engagement from those nonprofit SPCAs and humane societies.
That's great, thank you. Yeah, you know, having worked in specifically on exotic issues for the last 4 years, it is amazing what we allow in the home and think that it's safe for them to be there, and that the welfare of those animals is going to be acceptable in that home environment. So I couldn't agree with you more on that stuff. One other question we have is, and I wonder if it's the welfare issue, but what's the biggest challenge that you've encountered in dealing with these exotic pet issues?
You know, the biggest challenge I would say is, you know, when we adopt them out, which is very rare, like we don't deal with a lot of exotics because they die on our streets and we don't see them, or they die in an apartment building stuck behind the wall when it escaped from somebody's apartment, right? I want to make sure that when they get adopted, you know, that they have a good quality of life. So we'll print out messaging, you know, that we find on the internet. We'll talk to the person. But again, my thing is, I feel like that snake or lizard shouldn't have been here in the first place. It should have been living the good life, you know, whatever jungle or continent it's supposed to be on down by the river. So I never thought about this topic until I got this job here. All those years I worked in animal welfare in the States, just never thought about it until I got here. And when I spent some time in the room and I look at these snakes and the snake's just looking at me through this cage. And I'm like, that's going to be your whole life, is in that little room. It's just like, if my little office here, my whole life would be in this office, it would be awful. So why do we allow our communities, you know, to do that to exotics? So it's about educating. It's about talking to those parents and the kids and kind of saying, you know, this is not a great life. And once you encourage and educate more people, again, you cut off that demand for those animals, then you're not going to see a lot more scenarios where animal services having to get involved because there's a loose snake at a university campus.
I think that analogy of, you know, us conceiving of living in our office for our entire lives is a really good analogy of what it's like, especially for the terranium, you know, the animals that live in these cages or glass boxes for their entire life. Okay, we've got two more questions for you, and then we'll head off to the next speaker. What would you say the exotic breeder's responsibility is on this issue? So some breeders will say that the work they're doing helps for conservation, and is that an argument that you buy into, I guess?
So I don't buy into that argument. You know, there's a lot of ways we can conserve things without, you know, breeding animals in captivity. You know, a lot of these groups, and they're not bad people, they love their animals, but it's just a different philosophy that I share. they might have a portion of their proceeds go to a conservation group, right? But when you're looking at that snake sure is probably not thrilled to be sitting at that event, getting pictures taken for $10 or $20, and $2 every picture goes to some conservation group. There's things that we can do to help protect exotics in the wild, conserving green spaces without having to exploit ones in our own backyard.
That's great. Thank you. And then we've got one final question here from Julie from the New Brunswick SPCA. What happens when our vets and shelters are not equipped to manage these exotic animals?
Yeah, so we don't deal with a lot of them here because of our climate, but I can imagine, and especially in BC, where it's so beautiful and they rarely have any snow, which we're a little bit jealous of, that they probably have a lot more exotic issues than we do. And I can only imagine, like, there's not a lot of real rescues around in regard to exotics. Some groups will call themselves exotic rescues, but on the other hand, they're breeding exotics. So I can only imagine. I'm grateful I don't have to deal with that here with my team, but I can imagine that they run out of places to go, and that maybe there's not that many people who want to adopt these animals, right? And so the key is really just changing our societal views to kind of with an understanding that really these animals should be in the wild. And I hope as we all progress through society that we see that kind of pivotal change.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Thank you, Leland. We're gonna turn it over to our next speaker, and that is Jason Dykstra. Jason is the Chief Building Official for the town of Goderich in Ontario. He has a dual degree in both architecture and urban planning, and has spent the last 17 years in various professional roles in municipalities across Ontario. Currently, he's the Chief Building Official for the town of Goderich and is part of the team that oversees all building, planning, heritage, and bylaw issues within the town. The last year and a half, Jason personally has been involved with a neighbor attempting to start up a private menagerie, and has dealt firsthand with many of the land use issues regarding such acts. So Jason, I'm just going to mute myself, turn off my camera, and then turn the controls over to you, and you'll just need to accept them to move your slides forward.
Perfect. Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you.
Excellent. Well, first of all, I'd like to just thank the World Animal Protection of Canada for allowing me to speak today on this issue. And I'd also like to thank Zoocheck personally for the assistance that they had over the last year and a half with our issue in our subdivision. So thank you to you guys both. And I guess we'll get started. I've got two screens going here, so I might look off to the side as I'm speaking, but hopefully we'll get through this. Anyways, hello, my name is Jason Dykstra. I come to you today as mainly an affected landowner and parent. However, my background, like was just stated, is in urban planning and architecture, and I'm employed by the town of Goderich as the Chief Building Official, the Secretary of the Committee of Adjustment, and I look after all planning and zoning bylaw and other bylaw related issues within the town. So I come to you as a parent, but I also come to you with some credentials in regards to planning and zoning. This workshop is generally intended to describe how a community can be affected by exotic animals. Like I just stated, this is also a personal experience of myself. It did not involve my work at the town of Goderich, but within the subdivision where I reside. So let's get into it. Lions and tigers and Nimbys, oh my. I cannot advance the slide for some reason. Oh, there we go. So as the workshop is entitled, I'd like to introduce you to the NIMBY in the room. It's myself. For those who are wondering what a NIMBY stands for, well, as titled over the picture of the tiger, a NIMBY stands for Not in My Backyard. NIMBY is often used in the planning world to describe a group or an individual that does not want a certain thing or use where they live. But as I will explain, I feel I have a good reason to be a NIMBY in this situation, and I'm actually proud of such term due to the situation that I was in. On the left is a picture of my family. It's truly the best that we can do with a 5 and a 3-year-old. And on the right, you can tell a tiger. An animal in a million years I never thought I would be living next to. An animal that I never could fathom I would be getting woken up in the middle of the night while they were roaring for food. And an animal, well, you know what, I should say animals, because there's 15 to 20 cats on the property that stared at myself as I rode my bike with my kids past their property with only a little bit of wire in between ourselves. So given such description, I'm not sure how comfortable you would feel in such situation. However, I believe for the sake of myself and my family, I have good reason not to want such predatory, exotic animals in my backyard. And as I will show you, they were literally in my backyard. So just to give you a little bit of an understanding of where I live, Grand Bend, Ontario is a small urban community located on the shores of Lake Huron in southwestern Ontario. 8 months of the year, we are a sleepy community of about 4,000 people. However, in the summer months, many tourists flock to the area and take in our sandy beaches, amazing sunsets, shops, and provincial parks. We are small in area and population, but we definitely promote an urban type experience. I mainly state this to understand that we are no different than any other town or even city that you may live in. What happened to us could easily happen anywhere. It could even happen to you. So I want you to imagine being at your subdivision. If you don't live in a subdivision, I'm sure you've been to one before. Now imagine taking a leisurely walk through your subdivision on a Sunday afternoon, and then out of the blue, you hear this roaring noise. It's unlike anything you've ever heard before. As you keep walking, with my kids, mind you, the roar gets louder. Then you look off to the left and you see your neighbor, like this picture, installing approximately 5-foot high, rickety, unsafe construction fencing with 2 lions in the enclosure staring at you. As you can see, the lions stand about halfway up the fence. They could easily jump over the enclosure. You'll also notice that the fence is very uneven. It's not supported in the ground at all. This is construction fencing that is meant to keep people out of a construction site away from possible harm. It's not meant to keep anything out. Basically, the lions could knock over that fence whenever they wanted to. Now, what would you do in this situation? I can tell you what we did. We took a double take first to understand what we saw. Still can't believe it. Took a picture, this picture, and we went back to our house as quick as we could. This has started our worst nightmare. And those 2 lions transitioned into an exotic animal menagerie sanctuary that consisted of an estimated 15 to 20 dangerous lions and tigers, ear-piercing, noisy lemurs that kept us up all night, lynx, monkeys, zebras that escaped their enclosures, along with other exotics that transitioned in and out of the facility all summer long. Now, there's probably some of you out there that are thinking, oh, you must live in the back 40, you know, away from everybody. Far from it. As you can see from the 2 pictures here, one is the zoning, one is our zoning bylaw, the other is an aerial view of our subdivision. We live in a subdivision of almost 90 homes. The entire area designated residential in the official plan and the zoning bylaw. And on April 1st, 2019, without any notice, these large predatory animals were introduced to a residential subdivision and became my neighbors. So how could this be? A private person can really own a tiger or any other potentially exotic animal in Ontario? Well, the answer is yes, they can. So if I'm just getting this right, if you can own a tiger in Ontario, there has to be regulations for safety for people, correct? Well, actually, no. In Ontario, there are no provincial regulations in regards to fencing heights, materials, fencing sizes, and the types of animals that are allowed. Nothing. Basically, if you wanted to own a tiger as a pet and let it roam free on your residential lot, go ahead. So now that we know you can own a tiger, it can roam free, it can be anywhere, There's got to be vet checks or something to ensure they're not transmitting diseases to other animals or humans. Well, actually, no again. There are no regulations for that either in Ontario. So given this, if you now feel a little uneasy that a disease-ridden tiger could move in next to you tomorrow, what do? Well, I guess you call your municipality to see what they will do, because there is no provincial or federal regulations. It is the responsibility of every municipality to pass their own bylaw in regards to exotic animals, which creates inconsistent and sometimes non-existent regulations regarding them. So shortly after April 1st, 2019, we as a neighborhood are introduced to this new illegal commercial land use on a residential lot, calling themselves the Roaring Cat Retreat. It was spouted as a big cat sanctuary that'll be saving large exotic cats. And I just got to go off on a side note for a second. I use the term the term for this presentation, but I detest using the word cat to describe a lion or tiger. In my experience, the word cat is used to downplay a vicious, or what I'm trying to say is a lion and tiger shouldn't be determined as a cat, because a cat should be a domestic animal. As a neighborhood, this was not a welcome land use, and it placed most of the neighborhood in fear of our property, our general enjoyment, and our safety. We came to learn very quickly about the little known world of the exotic animal trade and the lack of regulation and safety regarding exotic animals and the facilities of these sanctuaries and zoos that house them. Once we learned more, we became even more shocked and scared as a community of what could happen at any given time. There are a lot of kids that play in this subdivision. If an animal got loose, who knows what could happen, and how do we protect them from an animal like this? Sorry, it's taking a second to advance the slide. So anyways, what would any community do? NIMBYs unite. We did everything that we could. We called our counselors. We made complaints. We held a gathering among neighbors affected to figure out what we could do. We realized that our council did not have an exotic animal bylaw, and they were not equipped at all to handle this situation. So they received hundreds of complaints. They came in quickly to put an exotic animal bylaw in place to basically look after this issue, because they didn't know what to do. While that happened, Roaring Cat Retreat, it gave them time to mobilize. It gave them time to add animals. It gave them time to create more noise, create more smell. And by far, it created them a platform around here to basically grow their audience. And it became a very divided issue between the town, between the people that loved animals and the people that wanted to keep their community safe. So just quickly to go over how this type of use can escalate very quickly. In April 1st, 2019, there was only 2 lions present. The exotic animal bylaw, like I just stated, was passed by our council on April 15th, 2019. April and May, municipal officials attended the site. They didn't receive any compliance from Roaring Cat Retreat. June and July, they were ordered to by the province. They were issued orders under the zoning bylaw, their exotic animal bylaw and such. Roaring Cat Retreat did nothing. Every weekend during the summer, hundreds of people flocked to the residential lot to pet the animals, causing traffic issues, among other issues. August, Roaring Cat Retreat admits they have over 35 exotic animals. Remember, in April, they only had 2, which consisted of lions, tigers, lemurs, monkeys, lynx, and others, all in enclosures that we did not feel were safe. Over 100 complaints are received by the police and bylaw due to the exotic animal issue: noise, smell, traffic, zoning, what have you. Residents of the neighborhood had to endure not going outside due to fear. Kids did not play outside. Residents are on record of having anxiety issues because they didn't want to walk down the street in case there was a lion or tiger that was going to follow them. My own kids did not sleep at night because they could hear the roaring of the lions and tigers out their window. The smell from the excrement and the effluent was horrendous. One thing that I did was I called, here in Ontario, we have minimum distance separations from livestock operations to know where they can house their manure facilities. Because exotic animals are not looked after, there's nothing in there to show where they have to put their excrement as well. It just escalated every week, and it didn't seem like it was ever going to end. And then it happened. In November 2019, the escape. 2 lion cubs escape and were photographed walking down the road in our subdivision. The excuse: vandals or people in the subdivision did not like Roaring Cat Retreat, cut the padlock that housed the lions, and let them loose. But Roaring Cat Retreat couldn't produce the padlock. You're kidding me. We don't want these animals loose. We don't want them here. We would never do such a thing. The more plausible, the gate was left open and human error occurred. The scary part, this was the only time someone took a picture of an animal escaping. There were many other documented escapes of the zebras, the hogs, the lynx, and other animals over the summer. So finally, a court case happened. I told you that there were issued charges over the summer months. The main issues that were at play, I'll read the 4 orders and then I'll go over them individually. So there was an order permanently restraining the respondents from breaching the zoning bylaw. Like I stated, this was a commercial land use on a residential lot. There was an order permanently restraining the respondents from emitting noise pursuant to the noise bylaw. Like I stated, it kept my kids up at night. It was amazing the smell, the noise that was emitted by these animals. There's an order permanently restraining the respondents from possessing exotic animals pursuant to the exotic animal bylaw that was just enacted. And there was also an order permanently restraining the respondents from breaching the open air burning bylaw. It cannot be proven, but there was allegations stating that they were burning feces and animal carcasses. So to go back a little bit, I just want to go through every one of them individually. So number one, the main issue and the one that I had the most involvement in was the zoning of the property. Now that I've told you up till now that the property in question is a residential lot, which it is. The history of this property was that it was in fact a zoo and zoned tourist destination at such time to operate a zoo. At the time, it housed many exotic animals. However, it closed in 2005. In 2007, the owner of the property rezoned the property to residential use to fall in line with the current official plan of the area, which designated the property as residential. Roaring Cat Retreat argued that since the zoo operated on the property previously, that the use was grandfathered and considered legal non-conforming, as they were told that from the municipal planner as well. This was quashed by the court as it was found that the property was rezoned properly in 2007 and a legal non-conforming use must continue with no lapse in operation to stay legal. I'll mention that later on in the slide, but that's through our Planning Act. The court also stated that the planner may have given the wrong information during the meeting with Roaring Cat Retreat if he stated that the legal non-conforming use was valid. In this case, a wildlife use had vacated the property and it was used for residential use for close to 11 years. Showing that the lapse had happened and therefore no legal non-conforming use could be established. Number 2, the noise emitted from this property was amazing. The roaring from the lions and tigers could be heard for miles. Personally, I had to console my 3- and 5-year-old, like I stated before, so they could even sleep at night. The court, however, did not agree with the municipality that the bylaw was contravened. The respondents made mention to other animals such as dogs that bark, and compared them to a lion. Due to this, they were unsuccessful with a noise complaint. Another contentious issue with this case is the municipality had never had an exotic animal bylaw and quickly passed a bylaw 15 days after receiving information that lions and tigers had moved onto the property. This was argued by the respondents, stating that the municipality hastily put in a bylaw about them just to hinder them. The court found that the bylaw was not in place for just roaring cow retreat, but for the whole municipality, and therefore did not believe that it was completed hastily. Therefore, the court found that the animals must be removed from the property at an agreed timeline between the municipality and roaring cow retreat. The animals were finally removed 6 months later in the middle of the night on June 4th, 2020. However, a separate case is still before the court to determine if the exotic animal bylaw was passed with complete fairness or not. Still not gone away. The fourth charge in regards to open air burning, in regards to the carcasses and feces, was basically struck down because nobody could prove that that was actually happening. So the lessons learned. Like I said, this is my bread and butter, zoning and official plan. It's something that I do every day. At the end of the day, our issue came down to a zoning issue. Basically, a guy tried to open a private zoo menagerie sanctuary on a lot that was zoned residential, improper for such use. As you can see, the yellow in the picture on the top right is residential uses in the official plan for our area. It's basically all yellow. The bottom right shows the residential uses as part of the zoning bylaw. As you can see, it's mainly all R6, which is single family dwelling in our area. The long skinny one that says R614 is the property that we're talking about. This land was used for a zoo over 10 years prior, and due to such, the planner told Roaring Cow Retreat in an email as described in the court brief, as long as they did not build anything new, enclosures or buildings, they could operate such use on the property as a legal non-conforming use. Even though for the past 10 years, this property was used for residential use and was rezoned properly in 2007 to only have residential uses on it. Scary thought, huh? Build nothing new and you're okay. So use the rundown, rickety old fencing to house your lions next to where the kids of the subdivision play. Don't fix it, because if you fix it, you'll be illegal. Weird. Such statement being legal non-conforming was proved wrong in the Superior Court, like I stated. However, due to such, it gave this private menagerie owner a place for his exotics to go as he was pushed out of the last community that he inhabited. And it also gave him a platform to gain support in the community to create a situation in which local residents felt terrorized. It goes to show you, I don't care if you're in municipal work or not, but always be cognizant of what you say and back it up with legislation. But I want to take you back for just a second. What if this was zoned properly, like it was at one time? There would be no stopping this individual from operating such a zoo or menagerie, housing potentially dangerous animals right next to a subdivision where kids play. It's a very scary thought. So all I can say, if you take anything from this presentation, check your bylaws, call your municipality, make sure you have an ironclad exotic animal bylaw in place. And also, like Leland stated, have funds in place to deal with these issues. Now, the other thing that I wanted to mention from the Planning Act, these are sections of the Planning Act that I'm bringing up on the screen, is the Ontario Planning Act, that is that our municipality, yet they ordered Roaring Cow Retreat under the zoning bylaw to cease use because of the use. They never fined them. Under the Planning Act, individually, this individual could have been fined $10,000 a day, and as a corporation could have been fined up to $50,000 a day. No fines were ever in place. And it goes to show you that I believe if you do not fine someone, they're going to do it again. So from a municipal standpoint, we really have to look at where we're going with this and not be scared to issue fines on these people so that they can be hindered in certain ways, or at least be accountable for their actions. Now, one thing that I wanted to mention too in lessons learned is how a community can be confused when you have a feel-good article like exotic animals and saving them. The official plan designated this area residential. The zoning bylaw designated the area residential. An exotic animal bylaw was in place. This is illegal on many counts. However, the animal loving and tourism community divided on the issue of a new business in the area. One, it was bringing in tourism. Many people seem to want to have a sanctuary that claimed to be saving animals as well. So for us to fight this from a safety point of view, from a community, it was a lot harder because of the stigma of it all. And that's what gave Roaring Cow Retreat their platform to just grow and expand and create this divide between safety and saving animals. It was a lot harder of a fight than I ever thought that I would be dealing with. The issue also exploded on social media, and the supporters of the sanctuary came out and made our sleepy little town blow up. It was insane. Because I fought the land issues on this, I personally lost friends, received threats at home, and had to hire a lawyer just to protect myself from individuals that became very hostile, wanting the animals to stay. It was, I still to this day can't believe the divide that happened between legal land use, safety, and trying to save animals, even though in my opinion, that's not what was happening. So other takeaways I hope for everyone to gain from this presentation is how such land use can frighten a community, can divide a community, and can enable a community. Us as a neighborhood, I never thought I'd see a day where our kids couldn't play in the streets because all the parents were scared that a lion or tiger might get out. Nobody wanted to go outside. Tensions between neighbors skyrocketed. They changed, as I stated in this article, they changed the school bus routes away from where this individual lived because they didn't want a lion or tiger to attack kids waiting for a bus. We were up all hours of the night, scared, not knowing what was going to happen, listening to these lions and tigers roar. It was insane. The other side of this is, I want you to make sure that as a municipality, you can be prepared with proper zoning and exotic bylaws in place, proper funding to take on such issues, and proper records to ensure the right information is being conveyed. Our council wasn't prepared. Not where I work, but my council where I live was not prepared. They did not have an exotic animal bylaw in place and reactively passed one. It is for the whole municipality now, and it's a great thing, but they were not prepared. They also were not equipped to handle this situation. They did not have fines in place. They did not know who to call to look after these animals. They were not ready. And they also, because of this, went down a road that they did not expect to ever have to fund. And I apologize that my phone's going off right now. What can we do? We can ensure your municipality has a bylaw in regards to exotic animals. In speaking with municipalities, it appears that 60-70% have some type of bylaw in regards to exotics. In my opinion, there has to be stronger laws from provincial or federal state. Also, review zoning bylaws and OP for zoo and animal sanctuaries. I know the first thing I found out when this happened to our situation is I looked at ours at work. I couldn't believe we didn't have anything in place in regards to what a zoo or animal sanctuary was, and if it was even allowed in our OP. There's too many holes in regards to this. Like was stated in other presentations, provide specific definitions of what a domesticated animal, livestock, native wildlife, and exotic animal is. in our situation, the individuals tried to state that his lions and tigers were domesticated because he basically had them since birth. So they were not there was no other definition. So I guess he has a domestic animal. No. Like I've stated before, evaluate your enforcement department, verify if they are equipped to deal with exotic animals if needed. And personally and through your municipality, lobby the government for stronger legislation in regards to exotic animals, zoos, and wildlife sanctuaries. It's the only way anything's going to happen. And that's basically my presentation. Oh, forget this. Can we go past that? That was a video that it's kind of funny if anybody ever watched it, watch it in their own time. Okay. Cassandra, you can take back over the controls if you like.
All right, I will do that. Did you want me to try and play the video or?
No, it's fine. It was something that we were going to do in another presentation for some other time.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for that, Jason. That certainly is a rather frightening tale, and I'm sorry that you and your family had to go through that. I certainly understand the concerns that you would have around that. We do have a couple questions for you. So the first one up is from Tina Heary. And she was just commenting on, that it's great that the BC government enacted the controlled alien species legislation in 2009 when 1,000 animals became prohibited. But it's still, it still obviously needs some work as all these things do. But she was wondering if you had any thoughts on why the province isn't taking similar steps here, and whether it's a concern over funds or for enforcement or just general disinterest. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Not really. Now, like I stated, in my position, I look after bylaw enforcement for our municipality, and the first, I was amazed that the province or the federal government has not done more in regards to this. We had an exotic animal in place in our work. I never thought we'd have to use it because I thought there was provincial and federal regulations. From the municipal standpoint, they're not aware. We're not aware that there is no regulations in place. Why those regulations aren't in place, I don't know. I really don't know. And if it has to be somebody that's lobbying the government to make those legislations, to make it heard, then that's what has to happen. But I don't know why they have not put them in place.
Do you know what happened to the end? So another question is from Willow Hecht. Do you know what happened to the animals and if the owner can still possess or display those exotics?
So there's been some recent videos online that the owner still does have his animals. They have moved from the facility next to us, but he still has them in his control. We don't know exactly where they are, but we do have a good idea.
Okay, great. And then the final comment is not a question, but a comment. Something similar happened in their county, in Butte County in California. A beloved wildlife sanctuary in a semi-rural residential town was eventually forced to relocate because neighbors complained and organized. It relocated to a truly rural area in the county where the animals continued to be inhumanely but legally under federal law confined, but supported by most of the community. I deem it a nearly impossible facility to protest or even monitor. And I think that's an interesting comment. And I think, when you were talking about the divide in the community is, I think one of the pieces of education that we as campaigners, we as educators, we as enforcement officers that we need to do in our communities is to truly educate people on what is truly a sanctuary and what is really just a prop for entertainment, for business, for whatever. And and talk about that, because it sounds like that's a lot of what you were up against, Jason, is just a complete lack of understanding of what was really happening on that property and the dangers to you and your community.
Yeah, a couple things with that. It doesn't matter if this happens next to a subdivision or if this happens, you know, in a rural community, in a rural area, away from everyone. The danger's there, and you can't tell me that it's not. That being said, yes, these. What I've learned is that anyone can, you know, come in and say that they're a sanctuary and state that, you know, we're saving all these animals. Yet in the background, there's breeding that goes on. They're being treated not humanely. And the question of safety comes into play, you know, on more than one different level. So it doesn't matter where this is located, it's not right. And I believe that there does have to be a lot better regulations in regards to what a sanctuary is, what a zoo is, how these areas are managed, and what type of enclosures they have, and the safety in regards to those closures, and the regulations in regards to those closures. All that has to be done. And until that's done, we're, you know, what happened to us could happen anywhere, and it creates a very unsafe environment.
Agree more. Well, thank you very much, Jason. That's all we have for the questions for you. So we're going to take a quick break now. It's 1:51 according to my computer. So if we could come back at 2, that would be really fantastic. And Jay, can you just confirm with me that you guys are still seeing a slide that says thank you, or do I need to reshare?
Nope, you're on the thank you slide.
Okay, super. All right, we'll be back in 10 minutes. Thanks, everybody. All right. I think we'll get started again so we can keep going along. We have a couple more speakers to go this afternoon. Hopefully you had a few minutes to stretch your legs. So thank you for coming back. Our next speaker of the afternoon is Amelie Martel. Amelie has a Bachelor of Laws from the Université de Montreal and is a member of the Quebec Bar Animal Welfare and the Animal Welfare Director from the Montreal SPCA. In 2011, Amelie started volunteering at the Montreal SPCA as a dog walker, and while pursuing her law degree at the Université de Montreal and the Quebec Bar, Mrs. Martel also completed a training in animal behavior. She started her legal profession at the McCarthy Tétrault and continued her involvement within the animals by joining the investigation department at the Montreal SPCA. And after a very rewarding experience as the animal welfare director in April 2000, after a very rewarding experience in law enforcement, she turned to operations management at the SPCA by obtaining the position of animal welfare director in April of 2018. In that capacity, Ms. Martel has brought an anti-speciest approach to her work, improving the care of all animals that enter the shelter. And in particular, she's overseen a paradigm shift in the treatment of non-Indigenous reptiles. And in 9 years of involvement within the organization, she's also taken on more than 70 animals into foster care under her wing for socialization, behavior, or medical rehabilitation, which is great. Amelie, if you could just give me a second, I'm just going to mute myself, turn on the video, and then turn over remote control, which will then allow you to advance the slides.
So in the meanwhile, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. So I'll just check if I have control right now. Yes, I do. So could you just take back the control, Cassandra, really quickly? I think there's a problem with my computer when I take the power.
Let me, I've taken it back. Let me try and reissue it to you.
Yeah,
and if not, just let me know and I'll take it back and you can just tell me when to advance the slides.
Oh, yeah, that would be great, actually.
Okay, all right, why don't we just leave it as that then?
Perfect, it's gonna be faster. So, well, first of all, hi everybody, and thank you for our host today. So I'll be discussing the major problems that we faced at the Montreal SPCA with turtles, mainly red-eared sliders and yellow-bellied sliders, but also some other exotic turtles. And the different approaches that we have put in place in the last 2 years to solve all these issues. So we use the following process in our analysis. So observation, understanding, and then taking action. So it will also be the canvas of the presentation today. So without knowing it, my presentation is actually kind of a follow-up to Leland Gordon's presentation. So I'm really glad we were on the same day. And on a quick note, if something is unclear, it might have been lost in translation between French and English. So feel free to ask questions on the content. I will not get offended at all. I will just try to explain it differently. So if you can switch to slide 2. So in order for you to understand a little bit our world at the Montreal SPCA, let me give you a quick 30-second overview. So we are an open admission shelter, so we do not refuse any animal that are located in the boroughs we cover. We are 151-year-old, so we were founded in 1869. There are roughly 15,000 animals that come through our doors every year for various reasons, and we only have one facility. So it's quite small, it's quite old. So if we compare with some other that I visited in Quebec and Ontario, it really limits our option when it comes to animal housing. And when I say that we intake all animals, it's not only pets, so we do accept a lot of farm animals every year and also wildlife. But some species are definitely more problematic than others when they arrive at the shelter. So turtles are one of them, unfortunately. So to come back to this main subject, I will elaborate shortly on the main categories of problems that we faced with turtles specifically. So they are complex animals to keep in captivity. And because of that, it had consequences to our activities at the shelter, including our inspection department. There's also a huge lack of resources for turtle pet owners in Quebec. And as you know, they are invasive species and they present disease risks. So I will try to go a little bit more in detail on all of these subjects. So if you can switch to slide 3. So this graph, yeah, I'm glad we see it completely. So this graph shows our intake stats. We received an average of 29 turtles per year for the last 7 years. So you might think 29, it's not a lot. How can it be such a huge problem, right? Well, the numbers seem small compared to the thousands of cats and hundreds of dogs we receive every year. But these animals, they have a significant impact as soon as they arrive at the shelter. So the reflection actually started in 2018. I had just made the switch from the inspection department to the animal welfare director position. And I faced a very particular situation. So we received 11 turtles. They were surrendered by their owner, and they used to live in small Rubbermaids. So I was a little bit shocked. And 11 turtles. So that number for cats, dogs, rabbits, rats, that would have been easy peasy for me. But for turtles, I realized that we did not have the equipment for them. We did not even have the space for 11 tanks for adult turtles in our exotic animal room. I was also afraid for our capacity for care because of the time that is required for the cleaning, the feeding, and everything. And we did not have any volunteers for reptiles because we do not keep them very long at the shelter. Yeah, it's really rare that we receive them. So this case also deeply affected the morale of my staff, mainly because of the fear of euthanasia. And that's something that I realized when I arrived my position. So euthanasia was a go-to solution before, and they were afraid that they would all get euthanized. And they were also afraid for the length of stay because we did not have easy outcomes for them. So I did not want to simply euthanize them before I would even try to figure out solutions. So I decided with the directions to give our conference room to all these turtles. And we started the observation phase to try to find solutions. So yes, we lost our conference room for a while. So we analyzed the turtle intakes in order to understand, well, why they would arrive at the shelter in the first place. So we realized that a lot of owner surrenders, including these 11 turtles, were because people bought these animals without being aware of their specific needs. So as you all know, unsuitable environment, improper diet, lack of UV rays, poor hygiene, they can all lead to a lot of problems. And most owners that would come to us, they were simply unaware that they were getting into all that when they acquired their turtle. And they realized it at some point and it was too much for them. So unfortunately, at the reception, we saw a lot of, it takes too much time, it's too much responsibility, it's really complicated, my aquarium is not big enough, I thought the turtle would stay small if I kept it in a small tank, I have no space for a bigger aquarium, etc., etc. So we also realized that people were not aware of the health risks of owning pet turtles. So again, there was a lack of education for some aspect, and it really concerned us about the information that was given to them when they acquired their animal. And through this observation, we realized that most of the turtles we would get were 10 years of age or older. So basically when the size of the animal would start to be problematic for the owner. Less frequently, we had cases of people moving, but the proportion was a lot smaller than what we see for cats and dogs, because animals are often banned in apartment buildings in Montreal. But I guess it's easier to hide a turtle than a barking dog, so complaints were less frequent. And even if the animal is prohibited, well, maybe it was tolerated. We also had cases of aggressivity between animals who were housed together, and maybe because at some point lack of space and fighting for various things like a basking spot. So the owner did not know that it could happen, but they didn't want to buy the equipment to house them separately, which comes back to the problem that the size of a minimal tank is pretty big, the space that it requires, the price of the equipment, everything is pretty problematic for most pet owners. Finally, regarding the surrenders, we had some turtles arriving at the shelter in really bad medical conditions because the owner could not afford vet care or could not find a vet in their area that would accept to treat their turtle. It's an exotic animal. So they did not know all the medical problems that turtles could have, and at some point they had to surrender it. So if we can skip to the next slide. So we even had some intakes through our inspection department. That's when we realized that these pets were not protected like any others under the Quebec law. So unlike most of the provinces in Canada, Quebec excludes exotic animals and wildlife in captivity from the Provincial Animal Welfare and Safety Act. So these animals are covered by another provincial regulation, but the penalties are a lot smaller. And the Montreal SPCA investigation department does not have the power to apply that regulation, unfortunately. Therefore, the complaints that we received at the SPCA had to lead to criminal investigation to be undertaken by our department. Basically, what it means is that the situation would need to be very bad for the turtle to be coming to the SPCA through our investigation department, and they were often euthanasia cases. For example, we had this case. So in 2017, a pet store owner, employee, was sentenced for neglect of a turtle. So the situation was reported, well, the complaint was made in 2014. So the turtle was extremely weak and had large ulcers all over the shell, including one ulcer that was so deep that we could see the lungs of the animal. And it was indicating a lack of vet care for several years. And due to the painful medical condition and the severity, we had to euthanize the animal. To our knowledge, this was the very first criminal conviction for cruelty towards a reptile in Quebec in 2017. So we were very proud of that. However, we are a little bit disappointed by the sentence. Cases like this one showed us that the observation we had made for surrenders could also apply to other situations, just like pet shops, because keeping these animals in captivity is simply very difficult and expensive to give them minimal freedoms and to respond to their needs. So we can skip to the next slide. So finally, we realized that there was a critical lack of resources for turtle pet owners. So a lot of shelters or pounds in Quebec, they do not accept turtles. And most rescues, they will simply refuse sliders because they are already full of them. So they are at capacity. Unfortunately, it's not a good thing because without proper resources, when people get desperate and they do not go to the best decision. So when they can no longer take care of their animal, they keep them in poor conditions sometimes. We saw some that tried to kill their animals or release them in the wild. And that's when it becomes a threat to our biodiversity. So next slide. Thank you. So after that observation phase, our understanding was the following. So turtles are really too easy to acquire. They represent health risk, disease like salmonella, and this is not always explained properly to the people buying them. They have a very long life expectancy, and they can become quite big, which is one of the big problems for the owners. They have complex needs that are hard to fulfill in captivity, and people do not really understand what they are getting into when they acquire one. And these problems, in addition to the lack of resources, have a direct impact on the animal welfare, but also they have a component on the risk on our biodiversity in Quebec. So now that we observed and understood the roots of the problem, we wanted to stop working on the symptoms. For us, the 11 turtles that were surrendered, they were a symptom of all the above mentioned elements. So we wanted to find solutions at the base of the problems. So we concluded that these animals were simply not suitable to be kept as pets. However, killing the animals that already exist, it seemed very unfair to us. So just like when we rescue wildlife that was kept in captivity for too long and they can no longer be released in the wild, we thought that there was a way to give a decent life to the one who already exist, like sanctuaries that we do for wildlife. But we also wanted to get rid of the problem and make sure it would not occur again. So next slide. So the first part of the solution was to become a resource ourselves for these animals. So we needed to change our procedures because before 2018, we had the procedures that we had 2 aquariums at the SPCA of a certain size. When they were full, automatic euthanasia or transfer to a pet shop. This was not a great solution at all. We didn't want to create more demand for these animals, and we really wanted to raise awareness on all the above mentioned issues. So in order to be taken seriously by authorities, population, and just to be part of the discussion when it comes to change, we needed to raise the bar internally first. So we started from almost nothing in terms of knowledge about turtle care, and it was a big shift for us, and it took about a year to realize it. So next slide. If you can switch to the next slide, slide 8. Yes. So we started by investing thousands of dollars in equipment, filters, light, bigger tanks, platforms, heater, thermometer, and everything that would break. And also remember, if you want to make that switch, that it's harder to raise money for a turtle than a cute kitten. So we really, and it was hard for our staff also to understand why we were doing it. But when we explained it, they really got on board with us. Also, we needed to educate our staff. So creating material for our kennel workers, for example, for the basic care training sessions. Even if housing and shelter is usually temporary, because of the long length of stay of these animals, and also the fact that we wanted to be able to show a decent environment for a turtle, we really wanted to have at least a couple of great aquariums that we could show to the public. And we needed to get external expertise too. So we partner with some vets who specialize in exotic animals for medical care. So we have here some x-rays of our turtles. So we were not used to treat these animals, and we had some turtles that had to go to the specialist many times to get treatments. But in the end, we were really glad that we did it. And it saved Speedy, that's Speedy on the X-ray. So next slide. So now we intaked the animal. We took good care of them, but we needed some positive outcomes. So our euthanasia rate, as I said previously, was really high for turtles before. But euthanasia should never be a go-to solution or an easy fix for a shelter. It should be taken very seriously, in my opinion. So the anti-species approach that I support is the principle that animals, whatever their species is, they value their life. And therefore, when it's possible to provide them with decent quality of life, we should protect their life when they are with us. However, it doesn't mean that we need to create more. In order to fulfill our mission sometimes and avoid euthanasia, we might get on the other side, which is not better, and we participate in the problem. So before 2018, like I said, we just sent the turtles to pet shops, but we didn't make sure that the information that the owner would get would be the right one. So actually, we were just contributing to the problem. So instead of killing the animal or sending them anywhere just to save their life, we really wanted to raise awareness and change things. So we started by offering foster placement where we would provide everything to make sure that they had at least the minimum. And it allowed us at the shelter to improve our C4C, but also reduce the length of stay in shelter. And it created ambassadors who could discuss about the problems with turtles with people around them. So that was great. But we also wanted to put them in adoption. We didn't want people to come to the SPCA to adopt a turtle because it was cool, exotic, or less complicated than a dog in their opinion. Just this year, we received more than 100 applications for turtles. And for us, it was 100 opportunities to discuss the problems with turtles and to do education. We wanted people who understood that they were rescuing an animal that should not have been put in these conditions in the first place and try to give them the best life possible in these circumstances. So it's a very different state of mind than to go to the pet shop, buy a baby turtle for a few bucks and put it in a small Rubbermaid tank. So we needed specialized guardians. So it comes back to maybe BC-SPCA presentation about their orange flag. The nice thing is that we found out some people who were interested in that journey. So we really increased our adoption. Slide number 10. But we needed a bigger audience. It's not with 100 people that we're going to change the world. So we wanted to have a bigger impact. So we made sure to talk about the problem with turtles every time we got a chance. So when we had media wanted to talk to the Montreal SPCA about adoption, surrenders, or whatever, well, let's propose to talk about turtles. Also, we made articles on our website. We reached about 20,000 people with our first article and 9,000 with the second one. And we did also several social media posts, and we reached between 40K and 48K with each of them. So it's a lot of reach for us. And we also had visits or meeting with elected officials, for example, with the City of Montreal, and we would always try to put it on the agenda. Authorities, media, population do not really care about turtles. So if you don't make it a priority, it will never be. So we were almost annoying with the turtles. It came back as a joke at some point with some elected official, but it was okay. We were talking about the issue. So next slide. That's when we started the advocacy for change, which is really the big part of our work. So next slide. So it started in 2018 with a large campaign. It was targeted to provincial elected officials, but it was on general aspects of keeping exotic animals in captivity. So it was with the Ministère des Forêts, de la Faune et des Parcs, which is the ministry who takes charge of the regulation on exotic animals in captivity. So they wanted to amend their current regulation, and the Montreal SPCA applauded the fact that they wanted to improve the safety of these animals, but we thought that they fell short of actually providing them with any meaningful protection, even with their amendments. So we recommended some improvements. For example, in terms of enrichment, socialization, exercise, so giving more than just the minimum. Also, for example, increasing the minimum required cage, enclosure size, etc., etc. So some changes were made in the provincial regulation, but for us, it was still not enough to solve our problem with the turtles. So next slide. That's when we started in 2018 to target the municipal powers. Due to our close relationship with the municipal administration, I mean, we have a lot of contacts there. We have contracts with them. We have frequent meetings with them. So it was easier for us to mobilize them on this issue. And we wanted to propose a modification to the municipal bylaw. So we had to make sure that they had the power to do so. So in Quebec, they have the power to regulate on all that's listed in this slide. So for us, it came up to safety, sanitation, nuisance, and environment mostly. So next slide. So there are various ways to regulate when it comes to pet. We did not want just to throw them the problems. We know that nothing would have happened. We wanted to come up with suggestions in order to accelerate the process. And we know that it can sometimes be very long when it comes to changing regulations. So our first thought was to require permits, but it's too resource extensive to put in place. The city would not want that. And it's also very hard to enforce by the city. So it's very different than for cats and dogs. So the dog in the dog park that doesn't have is a little tag, well, you're gonna be able to notice it. For a turtle in your bedroom, it's gonna be very hard to enforce. So then we checked the prohibition to own. So there were already disposition in the bylaw in Montreal. So they have a positive list of animals that you can own in Montreal, but it's quite broad. And the list allows some turtles at the moment, including red ear sliders. So we think, unfortunately, it's too large. Basically, venomous snakes, extremely large snakes, crocodiles, alligators are banned, but wolves, but a lot of animals that would be prohibited elsewhere in Canada are still legal in Montreal. Also, we were afraid that if we would target the prohibition to own, we would get a wave of surrenders at this shelter. And after that, it would be impossible to put them in adoption. So it would come back to our problem. So we decided to go with the prohibition to sell. And we got inspired by what has been done elsewhere in the world. So usually, those regulations were based on the fact that either red ear are invasive species or because of the disease risk that turtle represent. So for example, in the US, I'm sure you know about the 4-inch law. So it's forbidding the sale of turtles with the carapace length that is less than 4 inches. But there are also some states like North Carolina and South Dakota. They ban completely the sale of turtles. So it reads, no turtle shall be sold, offered, or for sale or wholesale in an establishment in North Carolina. So it's pretty intense. And in South Dakota, a person may not buy, sell, batter, or trade any species of turtle, which is pretty clear. There are also some states that have specific laws banning the sale of small turtles, so they can go a little bit bigger than what the federal provision asks. So after doing that analysis, we decided to propose a prohibition, but phrased differently. So our prohibition was to, for the sale, except the turtles coming from a shelter or a vet clinic. And I'm gonna explain in a second why we went with that. So if you can switch to slide 15. So actually, the city already adopted that clause for cats, dogs, rabbits in 2018. So we thought it would make perfect sense to simply add an other species. The problem is that 25 pet store owners in the meanwhile filed a class action. So they claimed that the city of Montreal did not have the power to adopt this regulation and that it affected their main source of income. It would impact their business. So I'm just doing a very, very quick summary of their arguments. So they also filed an injunction to stop the application of this section of the bylaw. But the injunction has been rejected in 2019, which means that at the moment, the regulation for cats, dogs, and rabbits does apply. But the class action is still active. So we do not know if the city or the owners will win this battle. Therefore, we understand that our timing is not right to amend the regulation at the moment. Add restriction to the animals that pet shops are allowed to sell or not is not something really popular, but we are confident that if the city wins this court case, the change that we propose is going to be adopted very, very easily, and it's going to have a huge impact on animal welfare. So basically, when we can switch to the next slide. Sorry, I'm going too fast. So basically, when you propose a change, just make sure you always have support, because there will be opposition. In this case, it was pet store owners, but it could be other entities. So, for example, they banned in Montreal shock collars, prong collars, and chokers. And some associations send letters to the elected official against that. So be prepared. Just find your allies beforehand and make sure they speak up. Your job is to build a case based on data, not only emotional or ethical motive. That doesn't work with elected officials. And make sure that all the people that you can have on your side will speak up. Elected officials, they are there for the population who voted for them. So if you show that you have a strong buy-in from the population, it's going to be really easier to make change happen. So petitions, letters to elected officials, have experts talk in the news for you, things like that. So we're still in the process. So I hope to come back in a year or two and be able to tell you more about the impact of all these actions that we have undertaken and for the turtles. But for the moment, that's all I have. I'm thanking you for your time, and we'll take the questions if there are some.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, we do have some questions. Let me just pull them up here. So when did you realize, when did you realize that the turtles really had become a problem?
Well, for me, for sure, it was when I arrived in the director's position as an investigator. It was really rare that we would get these cases. Like our day-to-day job was mostly for cats and dogs. However, when I looked at the stats, and I know if you want to go back, when we see the intakes, we had some years that we even had over 50 intakes of turtles. So that's huge. And if you look also at the euthanasia rate, that was at some year almost 100%. That's really sad. So I think it always been a problem, but it's a problem that we didn't want to see at that moment, or we had bigger issues. So in 2018 is really when we tried to work on that issue.
And do you think that there are a lot of turtles and tortoises in the pet trade, and sellers say they make great pets? So do you think that they should be able to sell them, or how would you respond to that if asked?
Unfortunately, even in the best conditions, I do not think they make great pets. There are really a lot of things that we see on our end. So for example, the turtles that arrive at the SPCA with legs missing, with like we saw the ones that from the inspection case, I think it was a really intense case, but we see some minor case like that with holes in the shells. It's not an easy pet to keep. And also we see a lot of people who they had 3 that they bought big like this. It was easy to keep at that moment, but 10 years later, it's not the same deal. So I do not think people really realize when they sell it, what is going to be the life. And if I can come back to Leland Gordon's presentation, living in a tank for all your life is not a quality of life.
Yeah, I would agree, and I mean, and we haven't even touched on. I mean, these are the turtles and these are the turtles that make it back into the shelter, and how many of them are just released into the wild to go on to become invasive, right? Which is what we've certainly seen here in Southwestern Ontario. So that's, yeah, it's a whole other thing. All right, so final question here: did bureaucrats and the elected officials respond positively to helping the turtles, or was a lot of education required?
Oh my God, this is a great question. So yes, there was so much education needed. They did not know. Simple as that, they did not know. So if you think the person who went to get a turtle does not know everything about a turtle, the elected officials did not know anything about turtles. So we needed to start from scratch. However, they were really interested. And because of all the data we could provide, it was really easy We made it easy for them to understand. And we found that actually it's really interesting. The person that is in charge of the animal aspect in Montreal right now is really invested in the turtles. So we are so happy about it right now. We hope it's not going to change.
That's great. And I do have a question here from Kelly, and I hope I understand the question. So it's, have sliders adapted to our environment and are creating other turtles now being part of the cities? So I maybe that's a two-part question. Is one, have they adapted if they are out in the wild, and how are they affecting the ecosystem? As like, are they crossbreeding and things like that?
So from my understanding, and I'm not a professional on wildlife, from my understanding, they adapted very well to environment. And the problem is mostly that our turtles that are native from Quebec, they will get less resources, like the space is going to be taken by red ear sliders. So it's going to be harder for them to survive. So actually the problem is for like paint turtles or other type of turtles that we do have in Quebec, that their population would decrease because of red ear sliders. I would not be able to answer about the crossbreeding, unfortunately.
Right. No, that's great. All right. Well, thank you very much. That was a really, really interesting presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much.
All right, we are on to our final set of speakers of the afternoon. Carolyn, and that is Carolyn Carter and Olivia Justason. Sorry, we have technical gremlins today. Pardon me, just give me one sec. Sorry, just give me, I apologize, just give me 1 minute. I really apologize for this. Okay, here we go. So our next two speakers are Carolyn Carter and Olivia Justason, and they are from the New Brunswick SPCA. Carolyn came on board as the executive director of the New Brunswick SPCA in June of 2017, after having spent 10 years in the field of adult education as both an education manager and an educator. She holds a Master's of Education diploma in university teaching and a Bachelor of Business Administration from the University of New Brunswick, as well as Bachelor of Arts degree from St. Thomas University. Carolyn has also extensive experience in the not-for-profit world, having previously served on various boards of directors, task forces, and advisory boards. And her interest in exotic pets industry was piqued after attending a seminar hosted by in Moncton by World Animal Protection and Zoocheck back in October of 2018, and has gone on to serve on a provincial committee. Carolyn is the proud fur mama of 2 cats, both of which were adopted at local SPCA shelters, and allows Rabid Bob, like NB, the New Brunswick SPCA office cat, to squat at her home on a regular basis. Olivia is the Deputy Chief Animal Protection Officer for the New Brunswick SPCA, and has been with the SPCA since 2011, after experience with the RCMP in Northern Alberta. Her love of animals and childhood dream of being a veterinarian influenced her decision to use law enforcement training to help the field of animal protection. Olivia primarily conducts investigations concerning dogs, cats, and horses, but avidly works towards legislation improvements, the welfare and legislation of the upcoming exotic industry, training her fellow animal protection officers, and is passionate about the education and awareness of the link between animal cruelty and domestic violence. When she isn't working as an animal protection officer, Olivia enjoys volunteering at her local animal shelter and spending time with her 2 dogs. So I believe I'm turning this over to Olivia. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to mute myself, turn off the camera, and hopefully this works.
There we go. Okay, perfect. So first we want to start by thanking everybody that worked so hard organizing these series of seminars the past 4 weeks. I've learned a lot. Olivia has too. So that's what we were just talking about prior to on here. We can't believe how much information has been packed in just over, afternoon sessions over the past month or so. We do get that we're the last presentations of the series, so we're not going to try to keep everybody longer than we have to. So we'll get started right away. So I'm Carolyn Carter. So I'm going to start by kind of giving a brief overview of the SPCA and as well too about our pet establishment regulation in the province. Okay, so basically the New Brunswick SPCA, we kind of differ from a lot of the other provinces around the country. So our role is primarily to do investigations of animal cruelty and neglect. We also do dog control for rural New Brunswick as well as a lot of the smaller municipalities. And we also do pet establishment inspections. So where we differ from the rest of the provinces is that we actually do not operate a shelter ourselves, but rather we rely on partnerships with 11 independently run SPCA shelters across the province. So I'm going to kind of give you a brief background too about the pet establishment regulation, and we'll get into it when I turn it over to Olivia, how it more applies to exotic pets. So the pet establishment regulation comes under the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, which was enacted back in May 31st of 2010. So in the regulation, a pet establishment is defined as an animal shelter, a pet retail store, or a kennel. So these are kind of like the various things. So you can see the pictures. There's like a pet store on your right. That would be at an animal shelter as well as the bottom. And as well too, so this actually covers in-home breeders as well. So that's kind of what the bottom picture is. Okay, so a lot of people ask, like, why would you regulate the pet establishment industry? So basically before this, there was no prevention, no requirements or standards. There was no tracking. So the province basically had no idea how many people were breeding and selling animals in the province, and there was no oversight over them. Poor living conditions. I'm sure many of us, growing up in the 80s and 90s remember, seeing pet stores in the mall where you saw like these poor animals in the window waiting to be bought, living in really small, poor conditions. But mainly the reason why the province implemented the pet establishment regulation was to kind of put a kibosh to the whole terms of like the puppy mills and the backyard breeders. So I'm gonna this was pictures from, well, actually I'll turn this over to Olivia because this is actually Olivia's case.
Okay, yeah, the regulation really was kind of spearheaded by issues with the breeding of dogs, but that doesn't mean that we weren't seeing a lot of issues in the pet stores, the retail stores. So these photos are actually from Pets Unlimited in Fredericton from a couple years ago. We ended up seizing several exotic pets. There was a hamster, a guinea pig, a bearded dragon, and several finches. So they were seized for unsanitary conditions, inadequate medical care, and malnourishment. So you can see from the photos, the cages were extremely unsanitary. The poor little hamster there on the right was dying in their little quarantine area of wet tail and had had no veterinary care provided. So we definitely do see issues in the pet retail stores. We're pretty fortunate in New Brunswick, really, especially after seeing some of these other presentations. We have such a small province, and we really only have a few stores in the province that sell live animals anymore, which is fantastic. We also have some pretty good exotic legislation too. So our kind of scope is a lot smaller than BC or Ontario for sure, but we still do run into these issues with the exotic animals in the pet retail stores.
Okay, so to kind of give a little bit more background too. So the definitions under the pet establishment regulation. So an animal shelter is any premises that provides stray, abandoned, or abused animals, a sanctuary, or where permanent or temporary adoptive homes are sought for animals. So the animal shelter, so all of our SPCA shelters across the province, they actually fall under that as well and are subject to the pet establishment licensing as well. A pet retail store is a premises where dogs, cats, rodents, reptiles, amphibians, pet fish, pet and exotic birds, and other exotic animals are kept for sale. And a kennel is specifically a premises where dogs are bred or boarded for consideration. So the exemptions under the pet establishment regulation, currently grooming establishments don't fall under it, neither do training operations, veterinary clinics, research and educational facilities, premises that board or sell livestock, boarding stables, and also zoos and circuses. So for anybody who wants to breed or sell animals in the province, have to go through an application process. There's a basic application form that's sent in through our website. So when someone's applying, they have to include proof of compliance with zoning bylaws and regulations. And it must include their name and address of a veterinarian providing service to the establishment, and also includes any applicable fees. So this is kind of what our form looks like right now. So you can kind of see it doesn't really capture a whole lot of information, but it does take stuff in this. And then this is like the application process before they're given a license. So the costs for a pet establishment license, so it's $100 for an animal shelter. It's $250 for a pet retail store. It's $250 for a kennel, and each license is valid for 1 year in which they have to renew. So once we get the pet establishment license application form through the website, an SPCA animal protection officer enters and inspects the premises by appointment, and the inspection checklist is based on standards of care. So some of these standards of care include 2007 CVMA Code of Practice for Canadian Kennel Operations, the 2009 CVMA Code of Practice for Canadian Cattery Operations, PJAC, Care of Small Animals and Birds in New Brunswick Pet Establishments of 2010, and also the Code of Practice for the Care of Amphibians in New Brunswick Pet Establishments 2010. So basically what these standards include, pretty standard. So feeding, watering, grooming, handling ill, injured animals, veterinary care, enclosures, structures, bedding, ventilation, temperature, lighting, sanitation, stocking density. So when the officers go in to inspect, they have a checklist, and that's the kind of things that they're looking for. So the license holder requirements, so they must include the name and license number of establishment in all advertisements. We actually have a really great relationship with Kijiji in that they will actually remove any ads in which a breeder or whoever is selling does not include a valid pet establishment license number. So in addition to that, they also have to post a license in a prominent location at their facility. They must keep specified animal registries for a minimum of 3 years. And they must also provide a person who acquires an animal with the animal's description under the registry. So I'm going to turn this over to Olivia now. So she's going to kind of talk about some of the wins and the challenges that we have and kind of what she sees as an officer.
Okay, so our win slide is one slide, and then I have probably 10 slides with issues. So that's kind of to be expected. This legislation came in really kind of quickly following a few large-scale seizures of puppy mill type operations with 100+ dogs. So it kind of came into effect really fast. And I don't think back then the people who put it into place spent as much time really looking over it or thinking about it before enacting it. But the win is that it's something, which is great because we're the only province to have a province-wide regulation looking over the pet establishment industry. So that was great, especially coming from such a small province. It allows us to track and monitor all of these places and draw those statistics. It provides a little bit of revenue for us. Obviously, we're a nonprofit, so we do rely on fundraising to operate. So that little bit does help and helps with the enforcement cost of it as well. We have seen a drop in one-time backyard breeders of dogs. So the people who just kind of think that their dog is great and want to have it bred with another dog, just hoping to have puppies that are just like theirs. Like we don't see that as much because now there's kind of a deterrent. They have to pay a fee. They have to have an officer come inspect their home. So there's not as many people as interested in doing that anymore, which has been nice. Public awareness and reporting has definitely increased. And again, it's more of a deterrent from wanting to get into that sort of industry. So we'll go through some of the issues that we've run into, and it kind of goes with the general enforcement and with the exotic industry in particular. So the inspections are really quite focused on physical environments, which the animals are kept in. So it doesn't really look at much past the minimum standards, and it doesn't really control who can breed what animals to what other animals, kind of ethical problems. It doesn't really govern those types of practices. So obviously we're always in need of improvement over standards of care for all species. Instead of just going for the minimum standard, we'd like to see the standards increased. The public perceives a pet establishment having this license as if it's a stamp of approval from the New Brunswick SPCA, or that we recommend them, which is absolutely not the case. It does not mean that any of these establishments are reputable. They simply meet these minimum standards. And we kind of try to describe it as if it's a restaurant. They all need a license to operate. It doesn't mean that it's a 1-star restaurant or a 5-star. They all have to meet a certain minimum standard. So what we run into with that is we have the more reputable breeders wanting some sort of way to stand out. So there currently isn't any type of star system or any way that shows that they kind of go above and beyond other than meeting those minimum standards. The current definitions of a pet establishment, and this is a big issue we run into, do not include groomers, in-home breeders of other species besides dogs, animal daycares, the virtual shelters and foster-based rescues that are popping up a lot, or the MLAPs, the mobile live animal programs. They're kind of getting more popular in the province, and obviously, as was talked about earlier in another presentation, there's many concerns for the animals themselves, for public safety, for disease spread. And again, there's nothing really regulating these right now in the province. And going back to the in-home breeders, the definition of the pet retail store, the government kind of reads that to be more of an actual business instead of people doing it in their homes. So the people that are breeding exotic animals, especially at other homes, are kind of flying under the radar of this regulation. Appointments are made for the yearly inspections, so the operators of these establishments know when we are coming. This kind of has to be done because we can't make a million trips out to try to catch someone at home, especially since a lot of these licenses are for in-home operations. There's no training or education requirement to obtain a pet establishment license. We would love to see in the future have a requirement for anybody, some sort of education or course required if they want to run one of these establishments. And there's no requirement to be a registered business with the province. So these are all kind of ways that if the legislation was expanded, we could more easily regulate who was doing this. Again, more of a deterrent. The more hoops they have to jump through, the less likely they will be to want to run a pet establishment. So then the ethical issues that we run into, this license that we give for pet establishments does not guarantee the health of the animals. It does not govern individual business practices. So these people who meet in parking lots, the really kind of sketchy underground operations, how much people charge for their animals, people getting refunds or not getting refunds on deposits, etc. It does not limit the volume of animals per establishment. And I have that one kind of starred because that seems to be the biggest complaint that we have about it. People don't want people to be able to just mass produce animals as a way of making money, which I think everybody probably watching this presentation would agree with, but it's hard to legislate that as long as all the animals are being given that basic standard of care. It doesn't govern breeds or mixes or what you can breed to what. People who breed too often, the breeding of undesirable traits, and there's no cap amount of establishments in the province. So these are all things that come up as issues or complaints about the current legislation. From our meetings with the government, they seem very resistant to limiting the volume of animals, forcing vaccinations and other medical care, or limiting the amount of establishments. And in their words, they can't legislate ethics. So it's trying to find that fine line to raise those standards and still have the scientific kind of enforcement approach to everything. Some other issues with enforcing the cost of the license is $250, and right now the fine for operating without the license is $140. So most people will probably stick with the $140 fine and just carry on. We don't currently have POPA ticketing authority, so that means that if we were to charge someone for operating without a license, everything has to be done in longhand court briefs in court. And again, all that work for a very low fine. We have a lack of reliable and cooperative witnesses in a lot of these things. As I'm sure a lot of other presenters in law enforcement understand, it's what you can prove in court. So we get lots of complaints and not a lot to back these things up to be able to act on some of these. We have no authority to seize animals unless the animals are in immediate need of care. So it would be great if we could just walk in and take any animal that was being sold without a license, but that's not the reality of it right now. And also, if we do go through the trouble of charging a lot of these people or companies, it's unlikely to result in very high fines and pretty unlikely to result in prohibitions on owning animals unless there's some pretty aggravating circumstances. And then on the kind of further into the enforcement issues, there's such a lack of knowledge and education on exotics specifically. So that comes from our side of it, the officers when doing the inspections and responding to complaints. So being able to check and know proper body conditions of all these different species of birds, amphibians, reptiles, fish, their habitat needs, diet needs, other specific needs. Not just for the reptiles, amphibians, birds, and small mammals as a whole, but all the individual species. There's so many different species with so many different needs, and we just don't have the education, and neither do the people operating these establishments to provide the care that's really needed. There's a lack of interagency cooperation. Not sure if everyone knows, but we had a very tragic accident happen in Campbellton, New Brunswick a few years ago. 2 boys were killed by a large African rock python that was being kept in an unlicensed pet establishment. So there was definitely some lines that didn't get crossed there between agencies. We used to have collaborative visits and cataloging with conservation officers. So us animal protection officers would attend the pet stores in the province to catalog all the species being sold. We actually ran into a few that were prohibited in New Brunswick. And then again, the complainants in general public not knowing the standards of care either, what the species require, and not knowing when to report improperly cared for animals or neglected animals, and how to care for exotic pets that they're interested in adopting. And again, issues with legislation. Exotics really kind of fall lowest on the totem pole. Unfortunately, everyone is all about the dogs, and then it's cats, horses, and other farm animals. And the last thing you hear about really is exotics. So there's a lack of advocacy for these animals, and we require a lot more clear standards for them. We also have a big lack of veterinary experts in the province. Not many vets will really even see reptiles and other exotics, and the ones that do kind of have a basic level of knowledge and really aren't comfortable testifying in court or providing that type of expert information. The top common complaints that we get the most with regards to exotic animals in New Brunswick is improperly cared for animals by the owners, so the living conditions by these privately owned animals. Public safety concerns, we do get many reports about people who are concerned if someone has a snake in the house. These can be from family members. We also get complaints from Child Protection on these people who have pet snakes. We do run into issues where we come across illegal species, pass the information on to conservation, who enforces that legislation, and it doesn't really go anywhere from there. So it kind of leaves us at a dead end of where we can proceed from there. We get complaints of live feeding. So people complaining that it's causing suffering to the prey and to the snake. The mobile live animal programs, and I'll also add we get hoarding situations where we run into some exotic animals. We had a case in Fredericton, New Brunswick in 2013, I think it was. We seized 145 animals from just a normal sized home, and there was over 25 large birds, a lot of cockatoos and a macaw, some Amazon parrots. So that was a lot of different resources that we had never needed before. There's also rats, bearded dragons, chinchillas, and dagoos. So when we run into these situations where we have to take these animals, we have to ask, where do we take them? So typically the SPCA shelters that we partner with in the province aren't able to. They, again, don't know how to take care of them and don't have the means. We fortunately only have one zoo in New Brunswick right now, and they also really aren't open to taking these animals either. So it's on us to try to find some place that we know they're going to be properly taken care of, and that is difficult. So monitoring, the continued monitoring of these places is crucial. It's the unannounced visits, so popping in between their official inspections when they don't have everything perfectly cleaned and waiting for us to see how these animals are actually being kept on a day-to-day basis normally. And as always, we really rely on the public to report anything that they see. So moving forward, our pet establishment regulation is on the table right now for review, which is fantastic because we already have kind of that baseline in place for legislation, and we're in a really good position right now to make some positive change moving forward and just to edit those standards of care and hopefully make it some of the best in Canada. We really need more education and awareness by everybody involved, by the public that are buying these animals, by the people who are caring for them, these pet establishments, and also cross collaboration between enforcement. So that is pretty much it. I don't know if Carolyn has anything good left. And that's our contact information if anyone has any additional questions or they want to reach out or have any question about our legislation.
Fantastic. All right, well, I have a question that came in via email during your presentation. Do you think reptile breeders, should they officially require a pet establishment license as well, even though they don't have a storefront? And if they are aware of these types of operations that exist, and what would happen if they run into such an operation if they don't have a license?
Great question. And yes, our hope is eventually with the next round of changes or very soon in the future that anybody selling animals in New Brunswick in general would require this license, and that the standards to have to obtain these licenses would be increased as well. Right now, if we come across anyone breeding or operating a pet establishment without a license, we always start out with education. We've had the legislation for 10 years now, so not many people don't know about it anymore, but sometimes they don't, especially if they're new to the province. So we always try to get compliance from them to obtain the license. And then if there's refusal, we kind of have to proceed from there.
Great. I have a question here. Do you have any advice for other SPCAs who are responsible for enforcing pet establishment licensing?
Another good question. We're really happy to discuss our legislation with any other agencies that are looking to implement something like this. Like I said, we've been at it for 10 years now, so we know where the biggest problems are with the enforcement of it, and kind of how it all kind of came about here. So it would be great to see all of Canada requiring this. I think it's probably a good first step for all provinces or SPCAs, especially the bigger provinces. It's probably easier to get this in municipalities than it is for the big province. So again, that's why we're kind of lucky in New Brunswick because it's so small here. But definitely we'd love to see every other province on board and kind of moving forward, and maybe eventually someday having a national standard for that.
That actually leads into the final question, and I think is a really good point. What role do you think that the government could play in supporting you guys better?
Money.
I'll let Carolyn answer this one.
Well, first thing that just popped in my brain, of course, is money. But I mean, that's everybody's hopes and dreams right there. No, the government, I think going through like the regulatory review process is always great. And we've been fortunate in the province is that when we do make recommendations, that they usually are quite receptive. But as Olivia was saying too, one of the issues that we do run across is trying to define what you can put in legislation and how ethics fall into play. So yeah, so with the government, if they could, I don't want to necessarily say if they could regulate ethics, but take more in-depth consideration of the ethical issues and not just kind of like the black and white.
That's great, thank you. All right, well, I think that wraps up all of our speakers today. I'm about to hand it over to Rob and Michele for some final thoughts before we close out. And before I do that, I just want to say I found today really fascinating. I thought all the sessions were really, really interesting. So thank you to all of our speakers who gave up their time this afternoon. And I will shut off my mic and turn it over to Rob and Michele.
Thanks, guys. Just a couple of comments from World Animal Protection and Zoocheck. First of all, I would like to thank all the speakers that put in their time and effort to present to our audience for the past 4 weeks. It's been super informative, lots of new issues that came up, and I think we have a lot of great context and network that we can rely on and talk about exotic pet issues. Also, thank you very much to Kaz for hosting these events. You did a great job. We couldn't have done any better. I also want to give a shout out to Jade, who is doing all the behind the scenes work and has made this event possible. So those thank yous first, and I'll hand it over to Rob, who will give a brief recap.
Yeah, thanks, Michele, and thank you as well from me to both Jade and Cassandra, making these as smooth as they can be, and I think they went very, very well. I have to say that when we were first planning these sessions, we didn't know what the response would be like, and So our expectations were kind of low, but I have to say that the feedback we've gotten so far, the numbers of people participating, and the numbers of people who have reached out to say that they'll be using all of these as a resource in the future has far exceeded our expectations. And we've actually had people telling us exactly that from as far away as Korea and the United Kingdom and elsewhere. So I think all of these sessions will be very useful in the days, weeks, and months to come. And it's very gratifying because, you know, when you're talking about exotic animals, they're largely a hidden problem. And often when you hear about them, you'll hear about that one snake that escaped or that one lizard that was found running wild where it's not supposed to be. But in fact, you'll know by now if you've watched these sessions that sure, they have implications on the individuals involved, but there are more than just those individuals that hit the newspapers. There are millions and millions and millions of animals involved in the pet trade. And I just wanted to say, or to illustrate just how many animals are involved in the pet trade by something that came out a few days ago in an online science magazine article about reptiles. This particular paper that the article was talking about indicated that the authors of the paper found that there were more than 4,000 species of reptiles that have showed up in the pet trade. That's more than 1/3 of all the reptiles in the world that are found in the pet trade. And what was even more shocking was the fact that, according to their research, 90% of these particular reptiles that were found on pet trade lists had no protection whatsoever. It was a free-for-all in terms of their exploitation. So we're talking about large numbers of animals. Just to quickly recap some of the things that were talked about, we started at the beginning with this list, and I think it's appropriate to end that when we're talking about exotic animals, we're talking about animal welfare issues, human health and safety issues, issues pertaining to the protection of the environment, conservation issues when you look at what's happening in the field with wildlife populations that are exploited as exotic pets. And of course, we've got all kinds of nuisance issues and community issues, and you've heard about some of them. So I just want to say, I hope everybody's learned a lot. I certainly did. I found a lot of these presentations extremely engaging and informative, and I'll be using them. I hope you do too. And thank you everyone for watching. And on that note, I'll turn it back over to Michele to, I guess, finish the multiple sessions that we've had over the last month.
What an honor. Just a quick update on our site. There will be an internet page that will be created, a hub where all the presentations can be found, PDF versions of the presentations, as well as some additional materials like Q&As about exotic pet expos, about mobile live animal programs, etc. These will become available probably mid-November, so keep an eye out on your email. You will be provided with a link. Also on this hub will be a bonus presentation. Well, not quite a bonus presentation, but Leslie Bisgold, who was supposed to speak during the first week, had some conflicts, scheduling conflicts, but was still willing to record her session. Definitely recommend it. She's very knowledgeable in the field of animal law. And then the final thing we'd like to request from you for analytics purposes, we have a post-event survey, as you can see on the slide. The link for that survey will be provided in an email you'll receive after this webinar. And we would ask you to fill out that survey so we can understand where to take it from here. If there's more interest in these types of events, or for example, if there are certain SPCAs or shelters or governments that are interested in particular elements that we can provide more information on, we would very much like to hear that. And I think that's it. Kaz, is there anything else that I missed?
Nope. I think you've got everything covered.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining this webinar series. Reach out to us if you have any questions about what you've seen. If you need to get in touch with any of the speakers, we're happy to provide the information. Enjoy the rest of your day.